Hello there, and welcome to our channel, where curiosity slows its pace, where science leans back in its chair, and where the long story of our planet is told gently enough to rest beside. Wherever you happen to be right now, whether the lights are low or the sun is just beginning to fade, I'm glad you're here. Tonight's journey is not a loud one. There are no explosions, no frantic countdowns, no heroes racing against time. Instead, it's about something far quieter, something that happened long ago, something so powerful, it reshaped the world and yet slipped almost entirely out of human memory. Before we begin, take a moment to notice where you are. Maybe you're listening from a bedroom or a couch or a place you visited many times before. What time is it there right now? Early evening, late night, somewhere in between? It's a small question, but fitting because tonight we'll be spending a lot of time thinking about moments that passed without anyone watching, hours that changed, everything while no one was keeping score. And if you find this calm or interesting, or simply a good way to let the day loosen its grip, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner of the internet find others who might need a softer place to land. Now let's ease into the story. History is usually loud about its disasters. It remembers dates, names, death tolls, and dramatic headlines. We learn about plagues because they emptied cities, about wars because they redrew borders, about eruptions and earthquakes because they buried towns and left behind ruins we can still point to. These are the events that arrive, with witnesses, with written records, with people shouting, warning, reacting, surviving. But every so often, something happens on a scale so large, so sudden, and so remote from the centers of record-keeping that it passes almost unnoticed by the wider world. No reporters arrive. No official chronicle is written. The event leaves no single ruin that can be photographed or fenced off. Instead, it leaves marks scattered quietly across landscapes, coastlines, forests, and ocean floors. In the year 1700, something like that happened. At the time, the world was already busy with its own concerns. European empires were expanding, trading, fighting, and colonizing. Cities were growing. Ships crossed oceans carrying spices, silver, people, and stories. Calendars turned. Kings ruled and fell. And yet, on a winter night along the western edge of North America, the earth itself shifted in a way that would have rivaled the greatest disasters ever recorded. The ground moved violently, the land sank, the ocean pulled back and returned as a wall of water. Entire coastlines were altered in a matter of minutes, and almost no one outside the region noticed. There were no newspapers there to report it. No colonial officials sent letters describing the damage. No official death counts were taken. The people who experienced it most directly lived in communities that passed history down through memory and story rather than ink and paper. Their accounts survived, but not in a form the wider world was prepared to recognize as evidence. So, the catastrophe slipped through the cracks of recorded history, leaving behind a strange contradiction. One of the most powerful earthquakes ever to strike the planet occurred in near silence. To understand why that matters, it helps to think about how we usually imagine Earth's past. We tend to picture change as slow and steady. Coastlines creep, mountains rise grain by grain. Rivers carve valleys patiently over thousands of years. And much of the time, that picture is accurate. The planet does most of its work quietly, But sometimes, all that slow movement releases itself at once. Stress that has been building for centuries is discharged in minutes. Energy that has been locked beneath the surface suddenly demands space. On that night in 1700, the Earth didn't whisper. It spoke in a language that moved continents. The strange thing is that for generations afterward, scientists didn't know it had happened at all. Maps showed stable coastlines. Settlements expanded. Forests grew. Rivers continued flowing. There was no obvious scar that said, "Here is where the world broke and reset itself." Unlike famous earthquakes in Lisbon, San Francisco, or Tokyo, there was no single city reduced to rubble and then rebuilt in full view of history. The event left no smoking crater. It left absence, silence, and subtle rearrangements that only became meaningful centuries later. For a long time, the Pacific Northwest was considered a relatively calm region geologically speaking. Earthquakes happened elsewhere. Volcanoes drew attention. Fault lines were things people associated with distant places. And yet, beneath the forests, beneath the coastal marshes, beneath the cold, dark water, offshore, a boundary stretched for hundreds of miles. Two massive sections of Earth's crust were locked together, slowly deforming, quietly, storing energy year after year. No one living above it could feel that process. Not in daily life, not in seasons or storms. Houses didn't creak, mountains didn't shake. To human senses, the land seemed solid and dependable. That illusion of stability is one of the reasons the story matters so much. When the catastrophe finally arrived, it wasn't preceded by obvious warning signs that anyone at the time could interpret. The ground simply failed its long promise of stillness. When it did, the shaking would have lasted several minutes, not seconds, but minutes. Long enough for fear to settle in deeply. Long enough for structures made of wood and earth to twist and collapse. Long enough for the coastline itself to drop, lowering forests into tidal reach. And when the shaking stopped, the danger wasn't over. The ocean, disturbed by the sudden movement of the seafloor, gathered itself and traveled outward, carrying that moment across the Pacific. Thousands of miles away in Japan, people noticed something odd. Coastal villages were struck by a tsunami without a local earthquake. Boats were damaged, fields were flooded. The water arrived with no obvious cause. Japanese officials recorded the event carefully, noting its timing, its height, its strange lack of origin. They called it an orphan tsunami, a wave with no parent. At the time, no one connected that wave to the far side of the ocean. Back in North America, life continued, shaped quietly by what had changed. Some areas never returned to their previous form. Forests drowned and became ghostly stands of dead trees, preserved in saltwater mud. Shorelines shifted inland. Sediment settled where it hadn't before. But without a written record tying these changes to a single moment, they were absorbed into the background of the land. People adapted, rebuilt, and moved on, carrying stories that would later be misunderstood or ignored. It would take centuries and a different way of listening to the Earth for the full picture to emerge. What makes the 1700 catastrophe so unsettling isn't just its size, though. That alone is remarkable. It's the fact that it reset the physical world in subtle but lasting ways, while leaving human history almost untouched. Borders didn't change. Governments didn't fall. No famous dates were memorized. And yet, the ground beneath millions of future people was permanently altered. The risks they would inherit were reshaped without their knowledge. That kind of event challenges our sense of control. We like to believe that the biggest dangers announce themselves clearly, that history keeps good records, that if something truly world-changing happens, someone will notice and write it down. The 1700 earthquake reminds us that the planet does not operate according to our systems of attention. It does not care where our cities are, where our archives are stored, or which events we deem worthy of remembrance. It also raises an uncomfortable question. If something this large could happen once, could it happen again? For now, though, it helps to stay with the moment before anyone knew what had occurred. Imagine a coastline that looks familiar and stable, forests rooted in ground that seems permanent, villages built with the understanding that the land beneath them is reliable. No sense of countdown, no awareness of pressure building deep below, just the ordinary rhythm of days passing. And then without warning, that rhythm breaks. The Earth has a way of keeping its deepest processes hidden until the moment they demand attention. Long before instruments could measure strain or satellites could track subtle movement, the planet was already keeping accounts, already storing energy, already preparing for release. The people living above that process in 1700 weren't careless or ignorant. They simply lacked the tools to see what was happening beneath their feet. Even now, with all our technology, much of that process remains invisible unless we know exactly how to look. That is where this story is headed. Not toward spectacle, but toward understanding. Toward the slow uncovering of clues left in sand layers, drowned forests, and distant wave records. Toward the realization that history can exist without ink, and that the Earth remembers events long after human memory fades. As we continue, the focus will shift gently from that quiet introduction to the physical forces at work, to the nature of the boundary that failed, and to the reasons this particular catastrophe managed to slip through history almost unnoticed. There is no rush to get there. Each step matters because this is not just a story about the past. It's about how we learn to listen and what happens when we finally do. Night does something particular to the human mind. Sounds travel farther. Familiar shapes lose their certainty. Even places we know well seem slightly less anchored once the sun is gone. In the winter of 1700, along the western edge of North America, night settled in as it always had. Fires burned low. The ocean moved in its steady rhythm. Trees stood where they had stood for generations. Nothing in the air suggested that the ground beneath all of it was about to fail. There was no warning in the way people usually imagine warnings. No distant rumble growing louder. No visible crack spreading across the land. No gradual buildup that might have convinced someone to run or shout or pray. The forces involved were far too deep, far too slow, and far too patient for that. For centuries, the boundary beneath the coast had been locked tight. Two enormous slabs of earth pressed together, refusing to slide past one another. Stress accumulated silently, millimeter by millimeter, year after year, long before any human stood nearby to notice. Then in an instant, measured not by clocks, but by physics, that resistance gave way. The first sensation would not have been sound, but motion, a deep, unmistakable lurch, as if the land itself had lost its balance. The shaking would have arrived abruptly and with full force, not building gradually, but asserting itself immediately. This was not a brief jolt or a passing tremor. It was sustained, relentless movement, strong enough to make standing difficult and disorienting enough to strip away any sense of direction. Trees would have swayed violently, their roots straining against soil that was no longer behaving as solid ground. Wooden structures, flexible but not indestructible, would have twisted, shifted, and in many cases, collapsed. Objects would have fallen not once, but repeatedly as the motion continued. The ground did not simply shake side to side. It rolled, surged, and heaved, turning familiar landscapes into something temporarily fluid. For those caught in it, time would have distorted. Long earthquakes have a way of doing that. Seconds stretch, moments blur. The mind, searching for reference points, finds none that stay put. Balance becomes guesswork. Sound becomes chaotic. A mixture of cracking wood, shifting earth, rushing water, and the low, unsettling roar that large earthquakes produce. Not from a single source, but from everywhere at once. Along the coast, the effects were even more dramatic. In some places, the land dropped suddenly, sinking by several feet. This wasn't erosion or gradual subsidence. It was an abrupt lowering, as if the coastline had exhaled and failed to rise again. Areas that had once been safely above high tide were now vulnerable. Salt water surged inland, not as a wave yet, but as an intrusion, flooding forests, marshes, and low-lying ground that had never before known the sea. The shaking likely lasted 4 to 5 minutes. That length matters. Short earthquakes are frightening. Long ones are exhausting. Muscles tense and remain tense. The body waits for the motion to stop. And when it doesn't, panic has more room to grow. By the time the ground finally settled, people would have been left disoriented, injured, and surrounded by damage that did not resemble the aftermath of storms or fires. This damage came from below, and it felt personal, in a way weather does not. But the earthquake itself was only the beginning. As the ground stilled, a strange quiet would have followed. Earthquakes often end this way, with a sudden absence of motion that feels almost louder than the shaking itself. That quiet, however, did not mean safety. Offshore, far beyond the line of sight, the seafloor had moved as well. A massive section of it had lurched upward and downward, displacing an enormous volume of water in the process. Water does not react instantly. It gathers, redistributes, and then moves with purpose. Along parts of the coast, the ocean would have pulled back first. This retreat can happen quickly, exposing seabed that is normally hidden, leaving fish flapping and boats stranded at awkward angles. To someone unfamiliar with tsunamis, this might have seemed merely strange rather than threatening. The sea, after all, pulls back and advances with every tide. But this retreat was different. It was faster, farther, and unconnected to the moon or the clock. Then the water returned. The waves generated by this earthquake were not the towering curling breakers seen in dramatic illustrations. Tsunamis behave differently. They move fast and carry immense energy. But in shallow coastal areas, they often appear as rapidly rising floods rather than single crashing walls. The water surged inland, filling spaces it had never filled before, carrying debris, sediment, and force deep into forests and villages. Anything not firmly anchored was swept along. Structures weakened by the earthquake itself stood little chance. Trees snapped or were uprooted. Fires were extinguished or spread depending on circumstance. Darkness made everything harder. Without electric light, without warning systems, without an understanding of what was happening, People had only their senses to guide them, and those senses were overwhelmed. Inland, beyond the reach of the waves, the damage took a different form. Rivers changed course as their banks collapsed. Landslides tore down slopes that had held firm for centuries. In some places, the ground liquefied, saturated soils temporarily behaving like thick fluid rather than earth, swallowing posts, tilting structures, and reshaping the surface in subtle but lasting ways. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the night continued. There were aftershocks, of course. Earthquakes of this size always produce them. Smaller, but still frightening movements that arrive unpredictably, reminding survivors that the ground cannot yet be trusted. Sleep would have been nearly impossible. Fires would have burned unchecked. Injuries would have gone untreated. People would have gathered where they could, sharing space, sharing fear, and trying to understand what had happened without any framework that could fully explain it. What makes this night so striking is not just its violence, but its isolation. This happened far from the centers of global communication. There were no telegraphs, no international reports, no coordinated response. News traveled at the speed of ships and letters. And in this case, there were few letters to send. The communities affected did not have printing presses or official chroniclers. Their experiences were recorded in memory, in oral tradition, in stories shaped to preserve meaning rather than precise measurement. Those stories spoke of shaking, of flooding, of land that betrayed expectations. Some described entire villages being lost. Others warned of the ocean's sudden anger and the need to flee to high ground. These accounts survived, passed down carefully, but when later outsiders heard them, they were often dismissed as legend rather than testimony. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the effects of that same night were quietly unfolding. In Japan, hours later, coastal villages were struck by waves that arrived without warning. There was no local earthquake, no shaking to explain the flooding. Officials documented the strange event carefully, noting its timing and extent. They had systems for record-keeping, calendars aligned, observations written down. But without knowledge of what had happened on the far side of the Pacific, the cause remained a mystery. The wave had crossed an entire ocean basin, carrying with it the imprint of that night's rupture. Back in North America, the landscape began its long process of adjustment. Flooded forests did not recover. Trees killed by salt water remained standing, their trunks preserved in mud that slowed decay. Over time, they became ghostly markers of a sudden change in elevation. Marshes formed where forests had been. New tidal patterns established themselves. The coastline did not snap back to its previous shape. It settled into a new one. People rebuilt where they could. Some places were abandoned. Others adapted. Life continued, not because the event was small, but because humans are skilled at surviving without fully understanding the forces they live among. The memory of the night did not disappear, but it did not become part of global history either. It lived locally, quietly, and without reinforcement from maps or textbooks. Generations passed, forests grew again, rivers stabilized, sediment layered itself patiently over the scars of sudden movement. To an untrained eye, the land appeared calm, ancient, and dependable. The idea that it had once convulsed violently enough to reset entire coastlines faded from relevance. After all, people tend to trust what they can see and feel. And for most days, the ground felt solid. That trust is powerful, but it can also be misleading. What happened in 1700 was not a random accident. It was the inevitable release of stress along a massive geological boundary. The same boundary remained there afterward, still capable of locking, straining, and breaking again. The night of shaking was not the end of a story. It was one moment in a much longer cycle that operates on time scales uncomfortable for human planning. Yet without clear records, without visible ruins, without names and dates etched into official histories, that cycle remained abstract. The night itself blurred into something like myth, something people vaguely remembered had happened long ago without urgency attached to it. The earth, however, did not forget. Every drowned forest preserved a timestamp. Every layer of sand deposited by rushing water told a story of sudden intrusion. Every shifted shoreline held evidence of rapid change. These clues remained in place, waiting for someone to notice that they did not belong to slow processes alone. For now, though, the night passed into memory, and memory passed into silence. The world above ground resumed its routines. The world below ground continued its slow accumulation of strain. Nothing about the calm that followed suggested how thoroughly the balance had been disrupted, or how much information had been buried in the aftermath. When people talk about great earthquakes, they usually come with labels attached, names tied to cities, dates burned into memory, numbers that make the scale immediately clear. The Lisbon earthquake, the San Francisco earthquake, the Great Kanto earthquake. These names serve as anchors. They let history point and say, this happened here, at this time, and it mattered enough to remember. But the earthquake that struck in 1700 has no such shorthand. It is known today by technical descriptions, by inferred dates, by the boundaries it ruptured, but not by a single name that people instinctively recognize. That absence is not accidental. It is the result of how power, geography, and memory intersected at that moment in history. At the time, the western edge of North America was not part of the global conversation. There were no major colonial capitals along the coast, no ports bustling with international trade on the scale of Europe or East Asia. The people who lived there had rich cultures, complex societies, and deep knowledge of the land. But their histories were not written in a form that the wider world would later catalog, index, and translate into scientific archives. When the ground broke, it did so beneath communities whose voices would not be amplified beyond their region. And so the earthquake remained unnamed, not because it was insignificant, but because it didn't pass through the usual filters of recognition. From a physical standpoint, this was not a modest event. Modern science, working backward from geological evidence, has concluded that the earthquake reached a magnitude somewhere between 8.7 and 9.22. That places it among the most powerful earthquakes the planet can produce. Events of this scale do not simply rattle dishes or crack walls. They reshape coastlines, alter ecosystems, and send energy across entire ocean basins. Magnitude, though, is a slippery concept. It is not something people living through the earthquake would have perceived directly. They would not have thought in numbers or comparisons. They would have experienced intensity, duration, and aftermath. And this earthquake would have delivered all three in abundance. The sheer length of the rupture is one of its defining features. The fault that broke stretched for hundreds of miles, running parallel to the coastline. When it slipped, it didn't do so in one neat, uniform motion. Different sections moved in different ways, some dropping more than others, some releasing more energy. This complexity is part of why the earthquake was so damaging and why its effects varied from place to place. In some areas, the land sank dramatically. In others, it shifted laterally. Offshore, the seafloor moved in a way that displaced massive volumes of water. All of this happened within a span of minutes, but the preparation for it had been underway for centuries. Tectonic plates do not hurry. They press, lock, bend, and resist over time scales that dwarf human lifespans. Along this particular boundary, an oceanic plate had been sliding beneath a continental one. But friction prevented smooth movement. The plate stuck. Stress accumulated. The upper plate warped slowly, storing energy like a compressed spring. Trees grew, rivers flowed, generations came and went, all while that invisible deformation continued. When the stress exceeded the strength of the boundary, the release was sudden and overwhelming. If this earthquake had occurred beneath a city with stone buildings and written archives, it would have been impossible to ignore. Entire districts would have collapsed. Fires would have raged. Death tolls would have been recorded and debated. Reconstruction would have been documented. The event would have entered textbooks early and stayed there. Instead, it occurred beneath forests, villages, wetlands, and coastal plains. The destruction was real, but it was not concentrated in a way that produced a single, iconic image. There was no ruined cathedral to sketch, no toppled palace to rebuild. The damage was dispersed across a vast landscape, much of it natural, much of it absorbed quietly into the environment. This dispersion is part of why the earthquake left no name. It did not announce itself through a single dramatic focal point. It altered many places slightly differently, leaving behind a patchwork of change rather than a single scar. Another reason lies in timing. The early 18th century was not an era of global seismic awareness. Earthquakes were often interpreted as local curiosities or divine signs rather than manifestations of deep planetary processes. There was no unified theory connecting distant tremors to one another, let alone to events across oceans. The idea that an earthquake in North America could cause flooding in Japan would have seemed implausible at best. Without a framework to connect these dots, each effect remained isolated in its own context. The shaking was remembered locally. The tsunami was recorded abroad. The land level changes were noticed gradually, if at all. No one stitched these observations together into a single narrative. And so the earthquake passed into a kind of historical limbo, too large to disappear completely, but too disconnected to be recognized as a unified event. Centuries later, when scientists began to uncover its story, they faced an unusual challenge. How do you name something that no one named at the time? How do you communicate its significance without the shorthand of a familiar label? The solution, for better or worse, was technical language. The earthquake became associated with the boundary that ruptured. It was described by its inferred date. It was categorized by its mechanism and magnitude. All accurate, all precise, and all slightly impersonal. That impersonality reflects the way the earthquake exists in our understanding. It is known not through eyewitness accounts, but through traces, through drowned forests, whose roots are still anchored in soil that now lies below tide level, through layers of sand deposited far inland containing marine organisms that could only have arrived on a sudden wave. Through subtle warping of landforms that betray rapid movement rather than slow erosion. Each of these clues tells part of the story, but none of them speaks aloud. They require interpretation. They require patience. They require a willingness to accept that some of the most consequential events in Earth's history do not announce themselves with names or monuments. The lack of a name also affects how the event sits in the public imagination. Named disasters feel contained. They feel like chapters with clear beginnings and ends. Unnamed ones feel unfinished, open, harder to grasp. This earthquake resists being boxed into a simple narrative. It stretches across cultures, across disciplines, and across time. It also resists complacency. When people think about seismic risk, they often rely on memory. What was the last big earthquake here? How long ago did it happen? Places with recent disasters tend to take the threat seriously. Places without them often assume safety. This 1700 earthquake undermines that logic. It demonstrates that absence of memory is not absence of risk. The land along the coast did not stop being dangerous because the earthquake went unnamed. The tectonic boundary did not relax permanently. It began almost immediately to accumulate stress again. Millimeter by millimeter, the same slow process resumed. The same potential for sudden release rebuilt itself quietly. This is one of the more unsettling aspects of the story. The earthquake left no name, but it did leave a pattern. And that pattern has repeated itself before, and will repeat again. Evidence from geological records suggests that earthquakes of similar magnitude have occurred along this boundary many times in the past. Not regularly, like clockwork, but often enough to establish a rhythm measured in centuries rather than millennia. Each time the land was reset, each time coastline shifted. Each time, ecosystems were forced to adapt quickly. Human presence along the coast has changed dramatically since 1700. Cities now stand where forests once grew. Infrastructure spans areas that were once marshes. Millions of people live above ground that last failed when no one was counting casualties. The unnamed nature of the 1700 earthquake makes it easier to overlook this continuity. Without a label to trigger recognition, it can feel like an abstract possibility rather than a concrete precedent. But the Earth does not distinguish between named and unnamed events. It responds to physics alone. There is also something humbling in recognizing how easily even massive events can slip past our systems of record. We tend to equate importance with documentation. If something is written down, measured, and categorized, it feels real. If it isn't, it can feel questionable, exaggerated, or incomplete. The 1700 earthquake challenges that bias. It forces us to acknowledge that our historical lens is narrow, that entire chapters of planetary change have occurred beyond its reach, that our confidence in understanding the past is often built on partial information. This realization does not diminish human knowledge. It deepens it. It encourages a different kind of attention, one that listens to landscapes as carefully as it listens to archives. As scientists began to piece together the story of this earthquake, they did so without the convenience of a name or a written account. They relied on patterns, on consistency across multiple lines of evidence. When drowned forests across hundreds of miles all showed signs of dying at the same time, questions arose. When sand layers of the same age appeared far inland at multiple coastal sites, hypotheses formed. When Japanese tsunami records aligned with those dates, the picture sharpened. Gradually, what had been invisible became undeniable. The earthquake did not need a name to prove its existence. It asserted itself through coherence, through the way independent clues converged on the same conclusion, through the impossibility of explaining those clues by slower, gentler processes alone. And yet, even now, the event sits uneasily in popular awareness. It is known within scientific communities. It is discussed in hazard assessments and planning documents, but it lacks the narrative weight that named disasters carry. It does not feature prominently in cultural memory. It does not anchor itself to a single iconic place. That may be changing slowly as understanding spreads. As people learn that one of the most powerful earthquakes in Earth's history occurred quietly beneath what is now a densely populated region, the absence of a name becomes part of the story rather than a weakness. It highlights the gap between what happens and what is remembered. It underscores the importance of looking beyond written history to understand the forces that shape our world. The earthquake left no name, but it left a legacy written into the land itself. A legacy that does not fade with time, but waits patiently to be recognized. And recognition, once it begins, has consequences. Because understanding the scale and nature of this event inevitably leads to another question, one that cannot be ignored for long. If the land could do this once under these conditions, what else is it capable of doing when the same forces align again? The ocean has a reputation for patience. It moves in cycles that feel predictable. Tides rise and fall. Waves arrive and retreat. Shorelines change, but usually slowly enough that the change feels negotiable. People build near the water because it seems steady, because yesterday's shoreline is close enough to today's to feel trustworthy. In 1700, that assumption was quietly undone. When the earthquake finished shaking the land, most dramatic transformation had not yet reached the coast. The ground had moved, structures had fallen, forests had tilted, but the sea was still gathering itself. Out beyond the horizon, where no one could see and no one could hear, the seafloor had shifted abruptly. That movement displaced an immense volume of water, lifting it, lowering it, and sending a pulse outward in every direction. Water, unlike rock, does not fracture. It transmits energy smoothly, efficiently, and relentlessly. Along the coast, the first sign of what was coming may not have felt threatening at all. In some places, the ocean pulled back. This retreat would have been rapid and unfamiliar, exposing stretches of seabed that were normally hidden. Rocks, shells, kelp, and stranded fish appeared where water had been moments before. For people accustomed to reading the ocean's moods, this sudden withdrawal would have felt wrong. But wrong does not always translate immediately into danger. Then the water returned. What followed was not a single moment, but a sequence. Tsunamis are rarely one wave. They arrive in sets, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes longer. Each surge can behave differently, depending on local geography. Narrow inlets amplify the water's height. Broad plains allow it to spread. Forested areas slow it, but also trap debris, turning trees into battering rams. As the ocean pushed inland, it crossed boundaries that had held firm for generations. Beaches vanished under rushing water. Estuaries expanded violently. Rivers reversed direction as sea otter surged upstream. Low-lying settlements were overtaken not by crashing surf, but by fast-rising floodwaters that filled spaces with frightening speed. The coastline itself did not simply flood. In many places, it failed to return to its previous position afterward. One of the most significant changes caused by the earthquake was subsidence. Large stretches of land dropped suddenly during the shaking, lowering entire regions relative to sea level. This meant that even after the tsunami passed, the relationship between land and water had changed. Areas that had once been safely above high tide were now within reach of daily waves. Forests that had grown inland from the shore found their roots submerged in salt water. Trees do not adapt well to sudden salinity. Within a short time, they died where they stood. Their trunks remained upright, preserved by the mud and lack of oxygen, forming what would later be called ghost forests. These were not the result of slow coastal erosion or gradual sea level rise. They were snapshots of a sudden drop, captured and held in place by the environment itself. Marshes formed where dry ground had once been. Freshwater ecosystems were replaced by brackish ones. The boundary between land and sea shifted inland, sometimes by hundreds of meters, sometimes more. These changes were not evenly distributed. Some areas experienced dramatic transformation. Others, protected by local topography, were altered more subtly. But taken together, they represented a regional reset. For people living there, this reset was immediate and practical. Familiar landmarks disappeared. Fishing grounds changed. Travel routes were altered. Places that had been safe became dangerous. Not just during storms, but every day. The sea had claimed new territory, and it showed no intention of giving it back. In the absence of maps or surveys, these changes were understood through experience. People learned where the water now reached. They learned which areas flooded regularly. They learned which places could no longer support the same activities as before. Adaptation followed necessity rather than planning. What did not follow was widespread documentation. There were no before and after charts, no coastal engineers measuring elevation loss, no centralized authority recording the extent of the damage. The coastline vanished in pieces, quietly absorbed into daily life and memory. Over time, those memories faded or transformed into cautionary stories, warnings about certain places, reminders of what the ocean could do. Meanwhile, the waves continued their journey. The energy released by the seafloor movement traveled across the Pacific at astonishing speed. In deep water, tsunamis can move as fast as commercial aircraft. They do not lose much energy along the way. They spread out, but they remain coherent, carrying information about the original disturbance across thousands of miles. Hours after the coastlines of North America were altered, that same disturbance reached Japan. There, the waves arrived without explanation. No local earthquake had preceded them. The ground had not shaken. There was no obvious trigger. And yet, the water rose, flooded coastal areas, damaged boats, and disrupted communities. Japanese officials recorded the event carefully. They noted the timing, the wave heights, the unusual absence of a local cause. At the time, these records stood alone. They were filed as anomalies, strange but contained. There was no reason to suspect that the answer lay on the far side of the ocean, beneath forests and coastlines that few outside the region knew much about. This separation of cause and effect is one of the reasons the 1700 catastrophe remained unrecognized for so long. The ocean connected the events physically, but human understanding lagged behind. Back in North America, the coastline's new shape settled into routine. Sediment carried by the tsunami and subsequent tides filled low areas, smoothing the sharpest edges of change. Vegetation adapted. New ecosystems established themselves. What had been a sudden transformation began to look over decades like a natural evolution. This is one of the ocean's quieter tricks. It erases the drama of its own violence by continuing to move afterward, reshaping what it has already reshaped. The evidence remains, but it requires careful attention to distinguish rapid change from slow. The ghost forest, for example, did not advertise their origin. To someone walking among them generations later, they might appear as remnants of an old wetland or victims of gradual environmental stress. Only by examining their roots, their position relative to current sea level, and their age could their true story be told. Similarly, the sand layers deposited far inland by the tsunami blended into the soil over time. Plants grew above them, animals burrowed through them. Without excavation, they were invisible. Without comparison, across multiple sites, they were unremarkable. This blending of catastrophe into landscape is part of why the coastline's disappearance did not echo loudly through history. It happened. It mattered deeply to those affected, and then it was absorbed. Yet the scale of what occurred should not be underestimated. The amount of energy required to move an ocean basin is immense. The displacement that occurred in 1700 ranks among the largest in recorded geological history. The coastline did not merely retreat, it was redefined by force. In modern terms, the changes would have enormous implications. Ports would be unusable. Infrastructure would be destroyed. Entire neighborhoods would be permanently flooded. Recovery would take decades. And rebuilding would be contested, planned, and debated. In 1700, the response was simpler, but no less profound. People moved, practices changed, knowledge adjusted. What did not adjust was the broader world's awareness. As centuries passed, the coastline that vanished became the coastline that had always been, at least in living memory. Maps drawn later reflected the new reality, not the old one. Anyone arriving afterward had no reason to suspect that the land had once extended farther seaward. Without a baseline, change is difficult to perceive. This lack of perception is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of how humans interact with time. We trust what we see repeatedly. We normalize conditions that persist across generations. The ocean's new reach became normal. It is only when science learned to look backward, to reconstruct past environments, that the vanished coastline re-emerged as a concept. By examining tree rings, sediment layers, and elevation changes, researchers could piece together a picture of sudden subsidence and rapid inundation. They could see that the land had not always been where it is now. This realization reframed the ocean's role in the story. It was no longer just a force that delivered waves. It was a recorder, preserving evidence of change in layers, in chemistry, in ecology. The coastline that vanished did not disappear entirely. It left traces in unexpected places. Those traces would later become crucial because once it became clear that the ocean had risen so dramatically, one's attention naturally turned to whether it could do so again. The forces that drove the water inland in 1700 were not exhausted by that event. They reset just as the coastline did, ready to accumulate and release energy once more. For now, though, the focus remains on that first transformation. On the moment when the boundary between land and sea shifted abruptly without warning and without a name to anchor it in history. The ocean rose, the coastlines vanished, and the world adjusted quietly around the change. What follows from that adjustment is not immediate catastrophe, but long-term consequence. The reshaped coast became the foundation for future settlement. The altered ecosystems influenced where people lived and how they lived. The memory of sudden flooding became part of cultural knowledge, even as its origin blurred. And beneath it all, the same boundary that caused the ocean to rise continued its slow, invisible work, setting the stage for questions that would not be asked for centuries, but would eventually demand answers. Long after the water receded and the ground stilled, the most durable traces of the catastrophe did not lie in broken wood or altered shorelines. They lived instead in memory. Not memory written down in ink or etched into stone, but memory carried in voices, repeated carefully, shaped by use, and passed forward because it mattered. The villages most affected by the events of 1700 did not leave behind official reports, but they did leave behind stories. And those stories endured in ways that physical structures did not. Some settlements were never rebuilt. This was not always because rebuilding was impossible, but because the land itself had changed in ways that made returning unwise. Where dry ground had once supported homes, salt water now lingered. Where forests had once sheltered villages, tidal flats now spread. People moved inland to higher ground or to places that felt safer based on experience rather than calculation. Over time, the original sites faded from use, their outlines softened by vegetation, erosion, and silence. Yet the knowledge of what happened there did not vanish. In many coastal, indigenous cultures of the Pacific Northwest, oral history was not casual storytelling. It was a system of record. Stories were repeated with care, structured to preserve accuracy across generations. They were told in specific contexts by people trained to remember them correctly. They included warnings, place names, and sequences of events meant to guide future behavior. These were not myths in the sense of fictional tales. They were memory tools. Among these stories were accounts of nights when the ground shook violently, when villages were swallowed by water, and when survivors fled to high ground in darkness. Some stories spoke of entire communities lost. Others described canoes carried far inland, trees uprooted, and coastlines transformed. The ocean was often described not as random, but as responding to something deeper, something beneath the land. For centuries, these accounts were heard, repeated, and respected within their cultures. Outside of those cultures, however, they were often misunderstood or ignored. Early settlers, missionaries, and later scholars tended to interpret them as symbolic or exaggerated, fitting them into categories of folklore rather than testimony. The idea that they might describe a real large-scale geological event was rarely considered. Part of this dismissal stemmed from unfamiliarity. European traditions placed written documentation at the center of historical legitimacy. Events without dates, signatures, or official seals were treated as unreliable. Oral accounts, no matter how consistent or widespread, were seen as fluid and prone to embellishment. This bias meant that valuable information remained effectively invisible to those who did not know how to listen for it. Another factor was scale. The idea that an earthquake large enough to reshape coastlines and send waves across the Pacific could have occurred without leaving a trace in colonial records seemed unlikely. It challenged assumptions about what events should look like in history. It was easier to assume the stories referred to smaller localized incidents than to imagine a catastrophe that slipped past the written record entirely. Within the communities themselves, the purpose of the stories was not to convince outsiders. It was to teach. Many accounts included instructions embedded within them, warnings about where not to build, reminders to flee inland after strong shaking, emphasis on the danger of low ground near the ocean. These were not abstract lessons. They were practical guidance shaped by experience. In some regions, villages were deliberately placed on elevated ground despite proximity to the coast. In others, escape routes to higher terrain were maintained and remembered. These choices did not arise from theoretical models. They arose from remembered consequences. The villages that were never rebuilt became reference points. Even when their physical remains disappeared, their locations were remembered. Certain places were avoided or treated with caution. Names associated with flooding or loss persisted in language, carrying compressed history forward. To those who knew how to interpret them, these names were maps of risk. When modern scientists eventually began investigating the geological history of the region, they were initially unaware of this layer of knowledge. Their work started with physical evidence: drowned forests, sediment layers, unusual landforms. As patterns emerged, questions followed. Why did so many coastal forests appear to have died suddenly at the same time? Why were tsunami deposits found far inland across a wide area? Why did these changes align so neatly in age? As answers formed, attention turned outward beyond geology. Researchers began comparing their findings with historical records from across the Pacific. The orphan tsunami recorded in Japan fit the timing. The wave heights matched expectations for a massive offshore earthquake. The puzzle pieces began to lock together. Still, one element remained underappreciated: local memory. When scientists finally took a closer look at indigenous oral histories, the alignment was striking. Stories described the same sequence of events that the physical evidence suggested: strong shaking, nighttime occurrence, sudden flooding, permanent loss of land, survival by fleeing to high ground. These were not vague similarities. They were specific, consistent, and widespread. The realization was humbling. It became clear that the earthquake had not gone unrecorded. It had simply been recorded in a way that the scientific community had not been trained to recognize. The voices from villages that were never rebuilt had been speaking all along. They had been telling the story with remarkable fidelity, even as the physical world changed around them. This recognition did more than fill in historical gaps. It challenged long-standing assumptions about whose knowledge counts and how evidence should be weighed. Oral histories were no longer seen merely as cultural artifacts, but as data points. Not data in the modern statistical sense, but data in the human sense. Observations preserved through careful repetition. Importantly, these stories did not only describe destruction, they described adaptation. They acknowledged loss without dwelling solely on it. They focused on survival, movement, and continuity. In doing so, they conveyed a worldview in which catastrophic change was part of living on a dynamic planet, not an aberration. That perspective contrasts sharply with how modern societies often approach disaster. Today, catastrophes are framed as interruptions, deviations from normalcy. They are followed by efforts to rebuild things as they were, to restore a sense of permanence. The voices from 1700 tell a different story. They accept that some changes are not meant to be undone. Some places once altered are left behind. This does not mean the loss was insignificant. On the contrary, the decision not to rebuild speaks to the depth of impact. It reflects an understanding that the land itself had changed identity. Returning would not restore what was lost. It would only invite repetition. As centuries passed and as new populations arrived in the region, this layer of knowledge was often sidelined. Settlements expanded into areas that had once been avoided. Infrastructure was built on low-lying ground. Rivers were constrained. Wetlands were drained. The warnings embedded in oral histories were not always translated or heeded. At the same time, the physical reminders of the catastrophe continued to fade. Ghost forests decayed slowly. Sediment layers were buried. The coastline's altered shape became familiar. Without either physical ruins or widely accepted historical accounts, the memory of the event lost urgency beyond the communities that had carried it forward. This gap between memory and action is one of the more sobering aspects of the story. The information needed to understand the risk existed. It was preserved accurately. It was shared responsibly, and yet it remained largely disconnected from decision processes that would later shape the region. Only in the late 20th century did these threads begin to weave together. As geological research confirmed the scale and timing of the earthquake, and as respect for indigenous knowledge systems grew, the voices from the past gained a new audience. What had once been dismissed as legend was reevaluated as historical testimony. This reevaluation did not diminish the scientific work. It strengthened it. The alignment between physical evidence and oral history provided independent confirmation from entirely different sources. It demonstrated that understanding the Earth's past requires more than instruments and equations. It requires listening. The villages that were never rebuilt thus serve a dual role in this story. They mark sites of loss, but they also mark sites of insight. They remind us that absence can be informative, that a missing settlement can speak as loudly as a ruined one. That silence, when contextualized, is not empty. These voices also complicate the idea of forgetting. The catastrophe may have been forgotten by global history, but it was not forgotten by those who lived closest to it. The forgetting was selective, shaped by whose records were valued and whose were overlooked. For a long time, the story stalled at the edge of uncertainty. The voices were there. The memories were consistent. The coastline showed signs of abrupt change. And yet, without something that could be touched, measured, and dated with confidence, the catastrophe remained just outside the boundaries of accepted explanation. It existed in fragments, persuasive but incomplete, convincing but not yet anchored to the kind of evidence that forces consensus. What finally tipped the balance was not a single discovery, but a shift in how people learn to read the ground itself. The Earth is not silent. It records what happens to it continuously. But it does not use words. It uses layers, chemistry, position, and pattern. For most of human history, those records were inaccessible, or at least uninterpretable. Soil was just soil. Sand was just sand. Trees were just trees. What lay beneath the surface was assumed to be uniform, unless proven otherwise. The idea that the ground might function as an archive took time to mature. When it did, the mystery that had lingered for centuries finally had somewhere to live. The first clues were subtle. In coastal marshes and estuaries, scientists noticed something odd while studying vegetation and sediment. Beneath modern soil layers, there were buried surfaces that looked like old land. Root systems still in place, trunks of trees cut cleanly by decay rather than erosion. These were not driftwood deposits or remnants carried in by storms. They were forests that had grown, thrived, and then died where they stood. What puzzled researchers was not just their existence, but their condition. The trees had not died slowly. They had not been weakened gradually by changing climate or rising seas. Their growth rings showed healthy development, right up until the end. Then abruptly, growth stopped. The cause was consistent across wide areas. Saltwater intrusion. Land that had supported freshwater forests had suddenly been lowered into the tidal zone. This kind of change does not happen gently. When land subsides slowly, ecosystems adapt, species shift, tree lines move, root systems adjust. What the buried forest showed instead was sudden displacement. The trees had been drowned, not transitioned. That pointed to a rapid drop in elevation, not a long-term trend. Still, one drowned forest could be explained away. A local landslide, a river changing course, a storm surge that never quite reversed. But as more sites were examined, a pattern emerged. These buried forests appeared along hundreds of miles of coastline. They shared similar ages. They showed the same abrupt termination of growth. The ground, it seemed, was telling the same story everywhere. Then there were the sand layers. In multiple coastal locations, researchers found thin sheets of sand buried beneath soil and peat. These layers were out of place. They contained marine materials, shells, microscopic organisms that live only in seawater. And yet, they were found far inland, beyond the reach of normal tides or storms. Above and below them were freshwater deposits, indicating that the area had been dry land before and after the sand arrived. These sand sheets were like fingerprints left behind by a specific kind of event. Storm surges do not produce uniform deposits across such large areas. They vary in intensity and extent. They tend to leave chaotic debris, mixed materials, uneven distribution. Tsunamis, on the other hand, are different. They arrive with speed and force, but they spread evenly. They can carry sand inland in a thin continuous layer, then retreat, leaving behind a clean signature. Once again, a single sand layer might be dismissed. But when the same type of deposit appears at dozens of sites, all dating to the same narrow window in time, coincidence becomes an unreasonable explanation. The mystery deepened, but so did the clarity. Radiocarbon dating provided another crucial piece. By analyzing organic material just above and below these anomalous layers, scientists could estimate when the changes occurred. The dates converged late 17th century, early 18th, narrow enough to suggest a single event, not a series. The ground was narrowing its testimony. But the most compelling evidence came from something that grows slowly and remembers precisely. Trees. Tree rings are among the most reliable natural records of time. Each ring represents a year of growth. Variations in thickness reflect environmental conditions. Stress, abundance, injury, and recovery are all written into the pattern. When a tree dies, suddenly, that record stops sharply. By examining the rings of drowned trees and comparing them across sites, scientists could determine not just the approximate era of death, but the exact season. The trees had died in winter. Their final growth ring was incomplete, indicating death after the growing season, but before the next began. This detail mattered. A winter death aligned perfectly with the timing inferred from Japanese tsunami records, which documented a wave arriving in January. Two independent systems separated by an ocean were pointing to the same moment. At this point, the mystery no longer lived only in memory. It lived in wood, sand, mud, and chemistry. It lived beneath the surface, waiting for tools capable of listening. What remained unresolved was mechanism. To drown forests, deposit tsunami sands, and send waves across the Pacific, something immense had to occur offshore. A storm was insufficient. A volcanic eruption would have left different evidence. The only plausible explanation was a massive earthquake, one that ruptured a long stretch of a tectonic boundary beneath the ocean. That realization forced scientists to confront a boundary that had long been underestimated. For years, the tectonic margin off the Pacific Northwest had been considered relatively quiet. There were no frequent earthquakes, no obvious surface ruptures, no recent disasters to draw attention. The prevailing assumption was that the boundary slipped slowly, releasing stress gradually rather than catastrophically. The ground evidence challenged that assumption directly. If the buried forests and tsunami deposits were the result of a single event, then the boundary was capable of locking and releasing stress in sudden, massive ruptures. The absence of recent earthquakes did not imply safety. It implied accumulation. This shift in understanding was not immediately comfortable. It required rethinking seismic risk for an entire region. It meant acknowledging that the calm of the last few centuries was not reassurance, but coincidence. Still, science does not advance by comfort. It advances by consistency. As more sites were studied, the picture sharpened further. Subtle warping of land surfaces indicated long-term deformation consistent with strain accumulation. Offshore surveys revealed scars on the seafloor aligned with expected rupture zones. Computer models showed that an earthquake of the inferred magnitude could produce exactly the kind of tsunami recorded in Japan. Each line of evidence reinforced the others. The mystery had lived only in the ground for centuries, not because it was well hidden, but because no one had known to ask it the right questions. Once those questions were posed, the answers were remarkably forthcoming. What is striking about this phase of the story is how quiet it is. There was no dramatic revelation moment, no single discovery that suddenly explained everything. Instead, there was a gradual tightening of constraints, fewer plausible explanations, more alignment, less room for doubt. In many ways, this mirrors how the Earth itself operates, slowly, patiently, without announcement. The ground had kept its record faithfully. It did not distort it. It did not exaggerate. It simply waited. When people finally learned how to read it, the story unfolded with clarity that was difficult to ignore. This realization also reframed earlier dismissals of oral histories. What had once seemed unverified now aligned with physical evidence and detail and timing. The ground and the stories were telling the same story in different languages. That convergence carried weight. It suggested that the catastrophe of 1700 was not speculative, not symbolic, and not exaggerated. It was real, measurable, and immense. It had reshaped landscapes, altered ecosystems, and sent energy across the planet. And it had done so without entering the written historical record in any conventional way. The mystery had lived in the ground because the ground was the only witness that remained accessible across centuries. This understanding also raised deeper questions about how many other events remain similarly hidden. How many catastrophes have occurred beyond the reach of our records, leaving only subtle traces that we have yet to notice or interpret? The Earth's surface is old. Human documentation is not. In this case, the alignment of clues was unusually strong. The time scale was narrow. The effects were widespread. The signals were consistent. But the process that revealed them was slow, incremental, and dependent on curiosity rather than urgency. There was no immediate pressure to solve this mystery. No recent disaster demanding explanation. The motivation came from patterns that did not fit existing models, from anomalies that refuse to be smoothed over. That kind of investigation requires patience. It also requires humility. It demands acceptance that previous assumptions may be wrong, not because they were careless, but because they were based on incomplete information. As the reality of the 1700 earthquake solidified, the conversation shifted again. The question was no longer whether such an event had occurred. The evidence was overwhelming. The question became what it meant for the present. Because the boundary that ruptured in 1700 did not disappear afterward. It did not heal. It resumed its slow accumulation of stress almost immediately. The same process that had loaded it before was still underway. The ground beneath the coast was once again keeping secrets. Understanding the mystery that lived in the ground was only the first step. Interpreting what that mystery implied for the future would require a different kind of attention. One that moved from reconstruction to anticipation, from reading the past to preparing for what the same forces might do again. There is something unsettling about an event that no one sees directly, yet leaves traces across half the planet. We're used to disasters being anchored to scenes, a city in ruins, a coastline washed away, survivors describing what they saw. This one resists that pattern. The catastrophe unfolded with immense force, yet left behind no single eyewitness account that could speak for it in the way history usually demands. And still, its effects were unmistakable, scattered across landscapes and cultures that had no direct contact with one another. The earthquake of 1700 did not announce itself to the world through spectacle. It did not unfold beneath the gaze of diplomats or merchants whose letters would travel widely. It did not interrupt the affairs of empires in ways that demanded documentation. Instead, it happened at the margins of global awareness, in a place where the earth could move freely without being immediately recorded. That absence of eyewitnesses is part of what allowed the event to drift into obscurity. But paradoxically, it is also what makes its reach so remarkable. Because while no single observer could see the whole event, the planet itself responded in ways that could not be contained. The rupture beneath the ocean floor sent energy outward in every direction. That energy did not care about borders, languages, or whether anyone was watching. It traveled through rock and water, reshaping coastlines here, disturbing shorelines there, and eventually announcing itself thousands of miles away in places untouched by shaking. This is the strange duality of the disaster. Locally, it was overwhelming and immediate. Globally, it was subtle and delayed. The people closest to it experienced chaos, fear, and loss, but lacked the means to broadcast that experience beyond their region. The people farthest from it experienced a quiet anomaly, a wave without a cause, a disturbance without context. No one at the time stood in the middle and saw both. Along the Pacific coast of North America, the shaking was unmistakable. Even without written testimony, the physical effects tell us that the ground motion must have been severe. Structures collapsed, landslides occurred, forests were permanently altered. But these observations reconstructed later do not include the human perspective in the way history often prefers. We do not have journals describing the sensation of the ground rolling or letters recounting the terror of the night. We infer the human experience from the scale of the damage across the ocean in Japan. The experience was entirely different. Their people felt no shaking at all. The ground was calm. The night passed as usual, and then hours later, the ocean behaved in a way that defied expectation. Water rose, flooding occurred, boats were damaged, coastal infrastructure was affected. It was alarming, but not catastrophic on the same scale. And because it lacked a local trigger, it became a puzzle rather than a tragedy. Japanese officials did what their system encouraged them to do. They recorded it. They wrote down the date. They noted the wave heights. They described the lack of an earthquake. They categorized the event as unusual and unexplained. These records were preserved, archived, and passed forward. They were not sensationalized. They were not connected to anything else. They simply existed as accurate observations waiting for interpretation. For centuries, they waited alone. What makes this disaster so unusual is that its clearest written documentation comes not from the place where it did the most damage, but from a place where it caused confusion. The tsunami was felt in Japan not as devastation, but as anomaly. And anomalies are often easier to preserve than catastrophes because they provoke curiosity rather than overwhelm. Meanwhile, the communities that experienced the earthquake and flooding directly preserved their knowledge differently. Their accounts did not focus on dates or measurements. They focused on sequence and consequence. The ground shook, the water came, people fled, land was lost. These elements mattered more than precise timing. The stories were structured to be useful rather than comprehensive. This difference in perspective is crucial. It explains how a single event could be both well documented and almost entirely forgotten, depending on which side of the ocean one stood. From the standpoint of global history, the disaster lacked eyewitnesses in the conventional sense. There were no recognized authorities whose testimony could be cited across cultures. There were no shared reference points. The people who experienced it most fully were not the people whose records were later privileged. And yet the event left fingerprints everywhere. The Pacific Ocean acted as a conveyor of evidence. The wave that reached Japan carried information encoded in its timing and height. The distribution of damage along Japanese coastlines provided clues about the size and location of the original disturbance. Those clues could not be decoded at the time, but they did not degrade. They remained fixed in the record. Similarly, the land along the North American coast preserved evidence in its altered shape, its drowned forests, and its disrupted sediments. These were not eyewitness accounts, but they were observations nonetheless. They were records written in matter rather than words. When science eventually learned to connect these distant effects, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. A single earthquake had produced consequences separated by an ocean, felt by people who would never meet and recorded in ways that would not intersect for centuries. This raises an uncomfortable question about how we define reality in historical terms. If an event is not witnessed by the right people, in the right way, at the right time, does it count? The 1700 catastrophe suggests that our criteria for recognition are narrower than the world itself. The absence of conventional eyewitnesses also shaped how long it took for the event to be accepted scientifically. Early hypotheses about massive earthquakes along the Pacific Northwest coast were met with skepticism. Without written records, without obvious ruins, without recent examples, the idea seemed speculative. The region appeared too quiet. The risks seemed exaggerated. It took the convergence of many indirect lines of evidence to overcome that skepticism. Geological data, tree ring analysis, sediment studies, historical tsunami records from Japan, oral histories from indigenous communities. Each piece alone might have been questioned. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be dismissed. This process highlights another aspect of the disaster's reach. It influenced not just landscapes and coastlines, but the evolution of scientific understanding. It forced researchers to expand their definition of evidence. It demonstrated that some of the most important events are those that challenge existing frameworks. The earthquake also exposed a temporal mismatch between cause and recognition. The event itself lasted minutes. Its immediate effects unfolded over hours and days. Its ecological consequences persisted for decades. Its scientific recognition took centuries. During that long interval, societies built, expanded, and planned under the assumption that the land beneath them was stable. The absence of eyewitnesses reinforced that assumption. After all, if something truly catastrophic had happened, surely someone would have written about it. The Earth does not operate according to that logic. It produces events according to physical thresholds, not human awareness. When those thresholds are crossed in places or times that fall outside our systems of attention, the results can be both enormous and invisible. The 1700 disaster exemplifies this perfectly. It was one of the most powerful earthquakes the planet is capable of producing. It reset coastlines. It altered ecosystems. It sent waves across an entire ocean basin. And yet, for most of human history, it existed only as a faint possibility, a suspicion, a clusters of anomalies without a unifying explanation. Even now, its lack of eyewitnesses affect how it is perceived. It does not occupy the same mental space as named disasters with dramatic photographs and survivor interviews. It feels abstract, academic, something reconstructed rather than experienced. But abstraction does not diminish consequence. The forces involved in 1700 are still present. The tectonic boundary that ruptured then continues to accumulate stress. The ocean still stands ready to transmit energy. The coastlines remain vulnerable to sudden change. The absence of eyewitnesses last time does not reduce the likelihood of witnesses next time. In fact, the opposite may be true. Today, millions of people live in the region affected by that earthquake. Cities stand where forests once drowned. Infrastructure spans areas that were once submerged. Ports, bridges, pipelines, and power lines depend on assumptions of stability that the 1700 event directly contradicts. If a similar earthquake were to occur now, there would be no shortage of eyewitnesses. Cameras would record the shaking. Sensors would capture the waves. News would spread instantly. The event would be named within hours. This contrast underscores the strange position of the 1700 catastrophe in history. It sits at the boundary between eras, old enough to escape documentation, recent enough to be directly relevant. The disaster without eyewitnesses thus becomes a lesson in humility. It reminds us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that the planet's most consequential actions do not require our attention to occur, that history, as we know it, is shaped as much by what was overlooked as by what was recorded. It also reminds us that connection often comes later. The people who experienced the tsunami in Japan had no way of knowing that the cause lay across the Pacific. The people who experienced the earthquake had no way of knowing that its echo would reach distant shores. Each group experienced only a fragment of the whole. Only centuries later did those fragments align. When they did, the disaster emerged not as a single dramatic moment, but as a distributed event, stitched together across time and space. An earthquake here, a tsunami there, altered landscapes everywhere, a planetary response to a sudden release of energy. This distributed nature complicates storytelling. There is no single place to stand and say, this is where it happened. It happened in many places in different ways with different meanings. And yet, that complexity is precisely what makes the story important. It challenges the way we think about risk, our memory, and connection. It asks us to consider events not just where they are felt most strongly, but where their effects propagate. For centuries after the ground settled and the water withdrew, the event receded from human awareness. Not erased entirely, but softened, blurred, and compartmentalized. Stories remained in some places. Anomalies lingered in others. But there was no single continuous memory that carried the full weight of what had happened. People forgot, not out of neglect, but because forgetting is often the default when daily life resumes and survival demands attention elsewhere. The land did not forget. It could not, because forgetting is a human skill. The earth records without intention, without preference, without interpretation. It keeps everything not neatly labeled or organized, but layered, stacked, and preserved according to physical rules that do not change simply because centuries pass. The memory of the 1700 catastrophe lived on in the ground in ways that were easy to overlook and difficult to decode. It did not announce itself, it waited. One of the most striking examples of this memory lay in places that looked unremarkable at first glance. Coastal wetlands, tidal marshes, river mouths, areas often dismissed as transitional or marginal, neither land nor sea. These were precisely the places where the earth had written its clearest notes. Beneath the grasses and mud, there were boundaries that did not belong to slow time, sharp transitions between soil types, sudden changes from freshwater deposits to marine sediments, layers that told of calm conditions interrupted abruptly by intrusion, then calm again. To the untrained eye, they were just layers. To someone looking carefully, they were punctuation marks. These layers did not drift gradually from one state to another. They switched. That distinction matters. Gradual processes leave blurred edges. Sudden events leave clean lines. The catastrophe of 1700 had drawn lines in the earth. In many places, those lines took the form of buried soils. ancient ground surfaces that had once been exposed to air, walked upon, rooted into by plants. Then suddenly they were sealed beneath new material. Sand carried inland by fast-moving water. Mud deposited by altered tides. Organic matter cut off from oxygen and preserved. The land remembered the moment it changed role. From ground to seabed, from forest floor to tidal flat. Trees, too, became archivists. The drowned forests that lined parts of the coast were not just ecological casualties. They were records frozen in place. Their roots remained embedded in the soil they had grown in, proving they had not been transported. Their trunks stood upright, proving they had not fallen to storms. Their death was quiet and simultaneous, consistent across wide areas. Tree rings provided a calendar the land could not lose. Each ring marked a year, each pattern a condition. When scientists examined those rings, they found no sign of prolonged stress. The trees were healthy, then they were dead, not gradually weakened, not dying in waves, all at once. The land had kept the time stamp intact. Elsewhere, the memory was more subtle. Small changes in elevation altered drainage patterns. Areas that had once drained efficiently became prone to pooling. Salt-tolerant plants appeared where they had no reason to before. These shifts were not dramatic enough to attract attention individually, but together they formed a mosaic of change that only made sense when viewed as the result of sudden subsidence. Rivers, too, carried memory forward. Their courses shifted in response to altered gradients. Sediment accumulated differently. Floodplains expanded or contracted. Over decades, these changes became normalized. The river people knew was the river shaped by the catastrophe, not the one that came before it. This normalization is one of the most powerful ways forgetting happens. When a change persists long enough, it becomes the baseline. Future generations inherit the altered world and assume it has always been that way. Without a reference point, difference disappears. The land, however, retains its reference points beneath the surface. What made the 1700 catastrophe particularly elusive was that it did not leave behind features that demanded explanation on their own. There was no singular chasm, no towering scarp cutting through the landscape, no isolated anomaly that screamed disruption. Instead, there were hundreds of small, consistent changes that only formed a coherent picture when assembled. This is the opposite of how people tend to notice things. Humans are drawn to extremes, to focal points, to singular causes. Distributed evidence requires patience. It requires comparison. It requires the willingness to believe that meaning can emerge from repetition rather than drama. For a long time, that willingness was absent. Early settlers and surveyors noticed oddities, sunken forests, marshy ground where maps suggested solid land, but these were attributed to local conditions: poor drainage, coastal erosion, normal variation. There was no incentive to look deeper and no framework to connect one observation to another across hundreds of miles. Even when scientists began studying the region more systematically, the dominant models worked against recognition. The tectonic boundary offshore was assumed to be benign. The lack of frequent earthquakes reinforced that assumption. Data was interpreted to fit expectation rather than challenge it. The land's memory remained intact, but untranslated. Translation began when researchers stopped treating each anomaly as an isolated problem and started asking whether they shared a cause. when drowned forests were compared across regions, when sand layers were mapped rather than excavated in isolation, when elevation changes were measured relative to long-term sea level rather than modern expectations. This shift in perspective allowed the land's memory to surface. Patterns emerged that could not be dismissed. Similar sequences of deposits appeared at similar depths. Radiocarbon dates clustered tightly. Chemical signatures aligned. The probability of coincidence shrank with each new site added. The Earth was repeating itself, not by recreating the event, but by repeating the evidence it had left behind. What is remarkable is how patient this memory was. It waited through colonization, industrialization, and modernization. It survived logging, farming, and development. It endured because it was buried, protected from erosion and reinterpretation. This patience stands in contrast to human memory, which fades quickly when not reinforced. Without rituals, monuments, or texts, even profound experiences can dissolve within a few generations. The land does not require reinforcement. Its memory persists by default. There is also something deeply impersonal about the way the land remembers. It does not care whether its record is comforting or alarming. It does not soften the message with narrative or context. It simply preserves what happened. When scientists finally learned to read that record, the story that emerged was not ambiguous. It was precise, consistent, and uncomfortable. The land remembered a sudden drop in elevation. It remembered salt water rushing inland. It remembered violent shaking. It remembered timing that aligned with distant records across an ocean. It remembered magnitude without exaggeration. What people had forgotten or never known was that such a thing had happened at all. This gap between land memory and human memory is not unique to this event. It exists everywhere in different forms. Ice cores remember atmospheric changes long after societies forget droughts. Coral reefs remember sea temperatures long after fishing patterns change. Rocks remember mountain building long after borders shift. The 1700 catastrophe is simply one of the clearest examples of how profound that gap can be. It also raises questions about what else the land remembers that we have not yet learned to read. How many past events remain unrecognized, not because the evidence is missing, but because the methods have not yet been applied? How many risks lie hidden beneath assumptions of stability? The realization that the land remembered what people forgot forced a recalibration. It required acknowledging that historical silence does not equal geological quiet, that a lack of documentation does not imply a lack of events, that the Earth operates on rhythms that do not align neatly with human attention spans. This recalibration had practical consequences. Once the scale of the 1700 earthquake was accepted, hazard models had to change. The assumed limits of what the region could experience were revised upward. Planning scenarios expanded. Emergency preparedness shifted from theoretical to historically grounded. All of that stemmed from learning how to listen to the land. Listening in this context does not mean hearing sounds or feeling vibrations. It means recognizing patterns that persist beneath daily noise. It means accepting that the most important information is often not the most obvious. It means trusting consistency over convenience. The land does not forget because it does not need to remember. It simply remains. It holds layers in place. It allows future observers to reconstruct past states if they are willing to look. The clues were never arranged neatly. They were scattered, uneven, and quiet. No single site held the entire story. No lone discovery could explain what had happened. Instead, the evidence waited in fragments, distributed across forests, shorelines, river mouths, and places where people rarely stopped to look closely. For centuries, these fragments existed without context. They were seen, sometimes noted, then set aside as curiosities or local quirks. What transformed them into clues was not their discovery, but their connection. Trees were the first to speak clearly, though it took time to understand their language. Along portions of the coast, especially in low-lying areas where fresh water once met forest soil, there stood strange remnants, trunks without leaves, gray, weathered wood rising from tidal mud, roots still anchored firmly in place, gripping earth that now lay below the reach of daily tides. These trees were not driftwood. They had not been washed in from elsewhere. They were exactly where they had grown. At first glance, they looked like the result of slow environmental change. Perhaps sea levels had crept upward. Perhaps drainage patterns had shifted. Perhaps storms had altered the landscape over decades. These explanations were comfortable because they were familiar. They did not require rethinking the stability of the land itself. But when researchers began to examine the trees more carefully, those explanations began to fail. Tree rings do not lie easily. Each ring represents a year, laid down in response to temperature, moisture, and growing conditions. When a tree experiences stress, the rings reflect it. Drought narrows them, flooding distorts them, disease leaves scars. Gradual environmental change leaves gradual signatures. The drowned trees showed none of that. Their rings were consistent and healthy right up to the end. Then they stopped abruptly, cleanly, no tapering, no warning. The trees had not struggled. They had not adapted. They had simply died. The cause was salt water. Salt leaves a distinctive signature in both soil and wood. It alters chemistry. It kills freshwater species quickly. When the trees were analyzed, the evidence pointed to sudden inundation by seawater, not prolonged exposure. This meant the land beneath them had dropped rapidly into the tidal zone. That detail alone narrowed the list of possible causes dramatically. Gradual sea level rise could not explain it. Storm flooding could not explain it. Only sudden subsidence on a regional scale could account for forests dying simultaneously across large stretches of coastline. Still, trees alone were not enough. Trees tell you something happened, but not how it happened or how far its effects reached. That is where sand entered the story. Sand behaves differently depending on how it is moved. Wind leaves dunes. Rivers leave layered deposits that sort themselves by grain size. Storms leave chaotic mixtures of debris. Tsunamis leave something else entirely. They carry sand inland rapidly, spread it evenly, then withdraw, leaving behind thin, laterally extensive sheets. When scientists began digging beneath coastal soils, they found these sheets again and again. They were often buried beneath layers of peat or mud that formed slowly in freshwater conditions. Above them, similar freshwater deposits resumed. The sand was out of place in both time and environment. It did not belong. Under microscopes, the sand told its own story. It contained marine microfossils, organisms that live only in salt water. These were not scattered randomly. They were sorted and deposited in a way consistent with fast-moving water coming from the ocean, not in land flooding or river overflow. The distance these sands traveled was particularly revealing. In some locations, they were found far beyond what even the strongest storms could reach. The energies required to carry marine sand that far inland pointed toward a tsunami. Once again, a single site could have been dismissed, but the same type of sand layer appeared in many places, separated by miles of coastline. Their depths were similar. Their positions relative to drowned forests were consistent, and when dated, they clustered tightly around the same period. Trees and sand were beginning to agree. Silence, however, was the most difficult clue to interpret. There was silence in the written record, silence in colonial archives, silence in European histories. For a long time, this absence was treated as evidence against the event. Surely something this large would have been noticed. Surely someone would have written about it. But silence is not neutral. It reflects where people were looking and what they considered worth recording. In 1700, the region most affected by the earthquake was sparsely populated by colonizing powers. There were no major ports sending regular dispatches to Europe. No administrative centers required to file reports. The silence was not because nothing happened. It was because the people who experienced it were not part of the systems that produced global documentation. When that silence was reinterpreted, not as denial but as context, it stopped being an obstacle and started becoming a clue itself. If the earthquake had occurred beneath a major colonial city, it would have been recorded. The fact that it was not suggested something about where it happened and who experienced it. This aligned with the geological evidence placing the rupture offshore beneath a largely undeveloped coastline. The silence fit the pattern. As researchers layered these clues together, they began to see a picture that was both detailed and unsettling. A massive offshore earthquake caused sudden subsidence along the coast. Forests drowned instantly. Tsunami waves carried sand far inland. The same waves crossed the Pacific and struck Japan. Indigenous communities remembered the event through oral history. Colonial records remained silent. None of these clues contradicted the others. Each filled a gap the others could not. Radio Arbonne dating tightened the timeline further. Organic material above and below the sand layers provided age brackets. Tree ring analysis narrowed the season. Japanese tsunami records fixed the date to January of 1700. The alignment was precise enough to be uncomfortable for skeptics. At this point, the silence was no longer a problem. It was simply one part of a larger data set. What made this reconstruction remarkable was not just that it succeeded, but that it succeeded without relying on traditional historical anchors. No diaries, no official reports, no contemporary maps showing before and after coastlines. The entire story emerged from indirect evidence, patiently interpreted. This required a shift in mindset. Instead of asking, "Where are the records?" scientists began asking, "What would the Earth record if this happened?" That question opened new paths of inquiry. It allowed silence to coexist with certainty. It allowed absence to be informative rather than disqualifying. The land had preserved the event in a distributed archive. Trees recorded vertical movement. Sand recorded horizontal energy transfer. Silence recorded social context. Together they formed a coherent narrative. What is striking is how ordinary these clues look in isolation. A dead tree, a sandy layer, a missing document. None of them demand attention on their own. It is only when they compared, aligned, and interpreted together that their significance becomes clear. This is why the catastrophe remained hidden for so long. It did not leave behind anything dramatic enough to force recognition. It left behind consistency. Consistency is easy to overlook. It requires patience to notice that similar features appear again and again across different landscapes. It requires collaboration to compare findings from different regions. It requires humility to accept that earlier assumptions might be wrong. When that patience was finally applied, the result was transformative. The Pacific Northwest was no longer seen as a region of modest seismic risk. It was recognized as capable of producing earthquakes on par with the largest known events on Earth. The boundary offshore was reclassified from quiet to dangerous. Planning models were rewritten. Emergency preparedness shifted. All of that came from clues hidden in trees, sand, and silence. There is also a deeper lesson embedded in this process. It speaks to how knowledge accumulates, not through dramatic discovery, but through careful synthesis. No single scientist uncovered the whole story. It emerged through decades of work across disciplines, through conversations between geology, biology, archaeology, and history. Each field contributed something the others lacked. Biologists understood tree responses. Geologists understood sediment transport. Historians understood the limits of written records. Indigenous knowledge holders provided contextual continuity. Together, they assembled a narrative that none could have produced alone. The silence that once obscured the event now underscores its importance. It reminds us that some of the most consequential truths are not announced. They must be earned through attention. As the story continues, this method of listening becomes increasingly relevant. The clues uncovered so far do not just describe a past event. They point toward patterns that repeat. The same types of evidence appear again and again in older layers beneath the coast, suggesting that the 1700 catastrophe was not unique. Trees beneath trees, sand beneath sand, silence beneath silence. The land is layered with memory, not just of one event, but of many. Each waiting for recognition, each capable of changing how we understand the ground we live on. Understanding how to read those layers does not make the future predictable, but it makes it less mysterious. It replaces ignorance with context. And context in matters like this can be the difference between surprise and preparedness. The clues have been there all along. They were hidden, not because they were rare, but because they were quiet. For a long time, the prevailing assumption about the land along the Pacific Northwest coast was simple and reassuring. It was considered quiet, not inactive exactly, but well-behaved. The ground moved slowly. Stress was released gradually. Earthquakes, when they occurred, were small enough to be inconveniences rather than existential threats. This assumption was not born of carelessness. It was built from observation, from decades of relative calm, from the absence of obvious scars, and from the understandable human tendency to trust what has not recently gone wrong. The science that emerged from the study of the 1700 catastrophe did not gently adjust that assumption. It dismantled it. Before this shift, the tectonic boundary offshore was often described as creeping. In geological terms, creeping faults slide continuously rather than locking up and breaking violently. They release energy in small, frequent movements that rarely produce large earthquakes. This behavior is common in some regions, and where it occurs, it genuinely reduces the risk of catastrophic rupture. For years, many researchers believed this boundary behaved that way. The logic seemed sound. There were no records of major earthquakes in the region's written history. Instrumental data from the modern era showed little seismic activity. The coastline lacked dramatic fault scarps or obvious evidence of recent uplift. Compared to places like California or Japan, the region appeared calm. That calm became the assumption. What the science of the late 20th century revealed was that calm can be deceptive, especially when measured against time scales far longer than a human lifespan. A boundary that appears quiet for a few centuries may simply be storing energy, not releasing it. The first cracks in the old assumption appeared when researchers began mapping coastal subsidence patterns. The drowned forests and buried soils were difficult to reconcile with a creeping fault. Continuous movement does not produce sudden drops in elevation. It produces gradual warping. The evidence pointed to abrupt change. Still, this contradiction alone did not overturn the prevailing view. Scientific paradigms do not collapse easily, nor should they. They are tested, stressed, and revised only when alternative explanations fail repeatedly. That failure began to mount as sediment studies expanded. Tsunami deposits appeared not as isolated anomalies, but as a repeating feature. These were not one-off events. Beneath the layer associated with 1700, older sand sheets were found, separated by layers of soil that indicated long periods of stability in between. This pattern suggested a cycle. Long, quiet intervals punctuated by sudden extreme events. A creeping fault does not produce that pattern. Tree ring data added another layer of pressure. The synchronized death of forests across vast areas required a regional mechanism. Localized processes could not explain the uniformity. The timing was too precise, the effect too widespread. At the same time, advances in plate tectonics provided a more refined understanding of how different boundaries behave. Subduction zones, where one tectonic plate slides beneath another, were increasingly recognized as capable of producing the largest earthquakes on Earth. The boundary offshore fit this category perfectly. The remaining question was whether it behaved like other known subduction zones. The answer, increasingly, was yes. Comparisons with regions such as Chile, Alaska, and Japan revealed striking similarities. Long intervals of apparent calm, few moderate earthquakes, then suddenly massive ruptures spanning hundreds of miles. In those regions, written history captured the catastrophic moments. In the Pacific Northwest, it had not. The science forced a reframing. Instead of asking why no large earthquakes had occurred recently, researchers began asking when the last one had occurred. Instead of treating silence as evidence of safety, they treated it as a gap in the record. Geodetic measurements added another critical piece. Using precise instruments, scientists could measure how the land was deforming in real time. GPS stations revealed that parts of the coast were slowly moving inland and upward, consistent with the upper plate being dragged by the subducting one. This deformation matched exactly what would be expected if the boundary were locked, not creeping. The ground was bending. This bending was subtle, millim per year, impossible to feel, invisible without instruments. But over decades and centuries, it represented enormous stored energy. The old assumption could not accommodate this evidence. Models were updated, hazard maps redrawn. The maximum expected earthquake magnitude was revised upward dramatically. What had once been considered a low-risk region was reclassified as capable of producing earthquakes rivaling the largest known events in recorded history. This was not a minor correction. It was a fundamental shift. The implications extended beyond academic debate. Infrastructure design standards had to change. Emergency planning scenarios expanded. Coastal evacuation zones were reconsidered. Public communication strategies were revised, though not without resistance. Rewriting an old assumption is rarely comfortable. There was skepticism, of course. There always is when established views are challenged. Some questioned whether the evidence truly required such a dramatic conclusion. Others worried about overestimating risk and causing unnecessary alarm. These concerns were not trivial. Overreaction can be as damaging as complacency. But the science did not hinge on a single data set. It rested on convergence. Independent lines of evidence collected by different researchers using different methods pointed to the same conclusion. The ground had moved violently in 1700. It had done so before, and it would do so again. The strength of this conclusion lay not in any one spectacular finding, but in the absence of reasonable alternatives. No other mechanism could explain the full set of observations. Not storms, not gradual sea level rise, not localized landslides. Only a massive, locked subduction zone rupture fit all the data. In that sense, the science did not just rewrite an assumption. It corrected a misunderstanding rooted in limited perspective. Human history in the region was too short to capture the full range of geological behavior. Written records spanned centuries. Tectonic cycles spanned millennia. The mismatch had produced a false sense of stability. Once this mismatch was acknowledged, the silence of the past made sense. The rewriting of this assumption also highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary work. No single field could have overturned it alone. Geology provided the framework. Biology offered timing. Physics explained the mechanics. History and anthropology contextualized the absence of records. Together, they formed a more complete picture. This collaborative nature is worth lingering on because it reflects a broader truth about understanding complex systems. The Earth does not operate in disciplinary silos. Its processes intersect. Its signals overlap. Understanding requires synthesis. The science that rewrote the old assumption was not flashy. It did not arrive as a single breakthrough. It accumulated quietly, methodically, until the weight of evidence became undeniable. There is also a lesson here about trust. For decades, people trusted the ground because it had not betrayed them within living memory. That trust was understandable, but it was incomplete. Science at its best extends memory beyond experience. It allows us to see patterns that no single generation could witness. In this case, it revealed that the calm was temporary. The boundary offshore is still locked. It is still bending the land. The same process that led to the 1700 catastrophe is ongoing. Nothing about the physics has changed. Only our awareness has. That awareness does not guarantee safety. It does not prevent earthquakes. But it does change how risk is perceived and managed. It replaces assumption with evidence. The rewriting of the old assumption also altered how other regions are evaluated. It became a cautionary example, a reminder that lack of recent activity does not imply lack of potential, that some of the most dangerous faults are those that have been quiet for too long. As this understanding settled in, attention began to shift again. The focus moved from reconstructing what had happened to grappling with what it meant going forward. If the science had been wrong before, what else might it be underestimating now? How should societies plan for events that operate on timescales far longer than political or economic cycles? These questions do not have simple answers, but they arise naturally once an old assumption is dismantled. The story of the 1700 catastrophe thus became more than a historical reconstruction. It became a case study in humility, in the limits of observation, in the dangers of extrapolating too confidently from short records. The science did not just reveal a forgotten disaster. It revealed how easily stability can be mistaken for permanence. And once that realization takes hold, it becomes difficult to look at the land, or the ocean, or the quiet of the present moment in quite the same way again. The word reset suggests intention, a deliberate clearing, a conscious decision to begin again. That is how humans tend to frame large changes, especially when they're sudden and far-reaching. We talk about resets after wars, after economic collapses, after disasters that force systems to be rebuilt. But what happened in 1700 was not a reset in the human sense. It was a reset imposed by physics, indifferent to memory, authority, or continuity. The world changed because the forces beneath it demanded release, not because anyone was ready for change. And while the physical world adjusted immediately, history did not. The land reset itself in ways that were profound and permanent. Coastlines shifted, elevations dropped, ecosystems reorganized, rivers found new paths, forests died, and new ones grew elsewhere. The relationship between land and sea was rewritten in minutes, then reinforced over years and decades. From the Earth's perspective, the change was decisive. One state ended, another began. Human history, however, continued almost uninterrupted. Empires did not fall because of the earthquake. Trade routes did not collapse. Borders were not redrawn. There was no global reckoning, no widespread sense that the world had entered a new phase. In the places where the catastrophe occurred, life was altered deeply, but those alterations remained local. Outside the region, the event barely registered. This divergence between physical reset and historical continuity is one of the most striking aspects of the 1700 catastrophe. Usually, events large enough to reshape landscapes also reshape narratives. They enter textbooks. They become reference points. They influence art, policy, and collective identity. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755, for example, had philosophical consequences across Europe. It influenced how people thought about God, nature, and risk. It was debated, written about, and remembered. The 1700 earthquake did none of that, not because it was smaller, but because it was quieter, in the ways that mattered to global history. The regions most affected were not centers of record-keeping power. The people who lived there had no incentive to translate their experience into formats recognized by distant societies. Their priorities were survival, relocation, and continuity, not documentation for an audience that did not exist. So while the land reset, history simply flowed around the event. This raises an important question. What does it mean for history to reset, and why didn't it? History, as commonly understood, is not a neutral record of everything that happens. It is a selective process. Events enter history when they intersect with systems that preserve them, amplify them, and integrate them into broader narratives. Those systems are shaped by power, literacy, technology, and attention. In 1700, the catastrophe intersected with none of them. The world at that time was not yet globally synchronized in its awareness. Communication was slow. Knowledge traveled unevenly. An earthquake on the edge of one continent could occur without affecting decisions on another. The tsunami that reached Japan was noted, but without context. It became an oddity rather than a revelation. History did not reset because there was no mechanism to force it to. The land, by contrast, has no such mechanism problem. When it changes state, the change persists, regardless of whether anyone acknowledges it. A lowered coastline remains lower. A drowned forest remains drowned. The earth does not need consensus. This difference reveals something fundamental about how humans relate to change. We often confuse significance with visibility. If an event is visible to enough people, recorded in enough places, and discussed widely enough, it becomes significant. If it is not, it risks becoming invisible, regardless of its actual impact. The 1700 catastrophe exposes the limits of that approach. From an ecological standpoint, the reset was undeniable. Species distribution shifted. Habitats disappeared. New ones formed. Nutrient cycles changed. These changes influenced food availability, migration patterns, and long-term ecological dynamics. The environment that followed was not the environment that came before. From a geological standpoint, the reset was equally clear. Stress was released along a major boundary. The land rebounded in some areas and subsided in others. The tectonic clock was reset to zero, beginning a new cycle of accumulation that continues to this day. From a cultural standpoint, the reset was selective. Communities closest to the event adapted their practices, relocated settlements, and embedded lessons into oral traditions. Their world changed, and their knowledge reflected that change. But beyond those circles, the reset did not propagate. This selective propagation explains why the catastrophe feels oddly detached from modern narratives. It happened. It mattered enormously. And yet, it does not occupy the same conceptual space as other worlding events. History, in this case, behaved conservatively. It preserved existing trajectories rather than incorporating disruption. There is also a temporal aspect to this divergence. Physical resets occur instantaneously or over short periods. Historical resets tend to unfold over longer spans as institutions respond, adapt, or collapse. The 1700 earthquake did not immediately challenge institutions with global reach. There were no centralized systems in the affected region whose failure would ripple outward. As a result, history had no reason to pause. This does not mean the event lacked consequences. It means those consequences were not aligned with the structures that history tracks most readily. Over time, this misalignment created a false impression of continuity because history did not reset. It appeared as though the world had not reset either. The altered coastline became the assumed baseline. The new ecological arrangements became normal. The absence of disruption in written records reinforced the sense that nothing extraordinary had occurred. This illusion of continuity is powerful. It allows societies to build confidently on altered ground without realizing it has been altered. It encourages assumptions of stability based on recent experience rather than long-term patterns. It fosters a sense of permanence that the physical world does not share. In this sense, the greatest impact of the 1700 catastrophe may not have been the immediate destruction, but the way its invisibility shaped future decisions. When settlers later arrived and established towns, they did so on land that had already been transformed. They drained wetlands that existed because of subsidence. They built on low-lying areas that had once been forested. They interpreted the landscape as static, unaware that it represented the aftermath of a violent reset. History's failure to record the reset became part of the risk. This pattern repeats itself in different forms throughout human experience. Floodplains that have not flooded in living memory are developed. Volcanoes that have not erupted recently are considered dormant. Faults that have been quiet for centuries are treated as inactive. In each case, short historical records are mistaken for long-term safety. The 1700-ish earthquake is a particularly clear example because the reset was so complete, yet so unacknowledged. There is also an emotional dimension to why history did not reset. Large, incomprehensible events often resist integration into collective memory unless they are framed, explained, and named. Without a narrative hook, they remain abstract. The catastrophe lacked a name, a central image, and a widely accepted account. Without those, it drifted. When modern science eventually reconstructed the event, it did so retroactively. It inserted the reset into a historical timeline that had already moved on. By then, centuries of continuity had passed. The moment for history to reset had long gone. Instead, the reset had to be accommodated quietly through revisions to hazard models, planning documents, and educational materials. These are important changes, but they do not feel like historical turning points in the same way revolutions or wars do. The contrast between the Earth's decisive reset and history's gradual adjustment highlights a mismatch in scale. Geological processes operate on time scales that dwarf institutional memory. When they act suddenly, the effects can be out of sync with human systems of recognition. That mismatch creates blind spots. It also creates opportunities for misunderstanding. When people learn about the 1700 catastrophe today, it can feel surprising, even implausible. How could something so large have happened without leaving a mark on history? The instinct is to suspect exaggeration or error. The truth is more unsettling. History did not fail because it was careless. It failed because it was never designed to capture everything. It captures what intersects with its mechanisms. The land, by contrast, captures everything by default. Understanding this distinction changes how the event is interpreted. The question shifts from why history forgot to why we expect it to remember in the first place. It encourages a more nuanced view of the past, one that acknowledges gaps not as anomalies, but as structural features. It also reframes the idea of reset itself. From the Earth's perspective, resets are routine. Stress accumulates, release occurs, a new configuration emerges. There is no memory of the previous state beyond what is physically preserved. From a human perspective, resets are disruptive and meaningful only when they interrupt continuity in ways we can perceive and record. In 1700, those perspectives diverge sharply. The world reset, history did not. This divergence carries forward into the present. We live on land that has already been reset once in this cycle. We inherit landscapes shaped by a catastrophe we did not witness and a history that did not warn us. Our sense of normal is built on the aftermath of an event we barely acknowledge. That realization does not require alarm, but it does require honesty. It reminds us that stability is often borrowed, not guaranteed. That continuity in records does not imply continuity in processes, that the Earth's timeline and ours intersect imperfectly long before instruments measured strain in millimeters or satellites tracked subtle movements of the ground. The warning already existed. It did not arrive as a calculation or a probability curve. It arrived as experience carried forward carefully because it mattered. The cultures that survived the catastrophe of 1700 did not attempt to preserve it as an abstract historical fact. They preserved it as guidance. And that difference is crucial to understanding why their warnings were so often overlooked. In many indigenous societies along the Pacific coast, knowledge was never meant to be stored for curiosity alone. It was meant to be useful. Stories were not told simply to explain the past, but shape decisions in the present and protect people in the future. When something happened that threatened survival, it became embedded in memory in a way that could not be easily discarded. The earthquake and the ocean that followed were exactly that kind of event. Accounts passed down through generations spoke of nights when the ground moved violently, when the sea behaved in ways that broke all expectations, when entire settlements were lost and the survivors escaped only by reaching higher ground. These were not framed as isolated tragedies. They were framed as lessons. Shake means run. Water withdraws means flee. Low ground is dangerous. Certain places are not meant to be lived on again. These warnings were specific. They named locations. They described sequences. They emphasized timing. They explained consequences. And importantly, they were repeated not once, but continuously, adjusted to remain relevant as landscapes and languages changed. From the outside, these stories were often labeled as myths. That label did a great deal of damage. It implied symbolism where there was instruction. It implied exaggeration where there was precision. It implied imagination where there was memory. The dismissal was not usually malicious. It was structural. Western historical traditions privileged written records, dates, and named individuals. Oral transmission was viewed as unreliable because it lacked fixed text. What this perspective failed to recognize was that reliability depends on method, not medium. In cultures where oral transmission is central, memory is trained, reinforced, and verified through repetition and communal accountability. A story that keeps people alive does not survive by being inaccurate. One of the most striking aspects of these warnings is how closely they align with what modern science later confirmed. Strong shaking precedes flooding. The ocean can arrive suddenly and travel far inland. The safest response is immediate movement to high ground. Returning to the same place is often unwise. These are not general platitudes. They are operational instructions. In some communities, settlement patterns reflected this knowledge. Villages were built on elevated ground even when the coast offered easier access to resources. Paths to higher terrain were maintained and remembered. Certain low-lying areas were used seasonally or avoided altogether. These choices did not come from theoretical risk assessments. They came from inherited experience. When outsiders arrived centuries later, these choices were often misunderstood. Elevated settlements were seen as cultural preference rather than practical adaptation. Warnings about certain areas were interpreted as superstition. The absence of permanent structures in fertile lands was seen as inefficiency rather than caution. This misinterpretation had consequences. As colonization expanded, land use changed rapidly. Wetlands were drained. Rivers were constrained. Settlements grew in places that had once been avoided. Infrastructure was built under assumptions of stability that the land itself did not support. The warnings were there, but they were not translated. Part of the difficulty lies in how warnings were framed. Indigenous accounts did not usually include dates or magnitudes. They did not quantify risk. They described cause and effect. For people accustomed to numerical certainty, this kind of knowledge can feel imprecise. But precision and usefulness are not the same thing. The warnings did not attempt to predict exactly when the next earthquake would occur. They emphasized that it would occur and what to do when it did. That distinction is often lost in modern discussions of risk. We focus heavily on timing and probability, sometimes at the expense of preparedness. The surviving cultures focused on response. Another important element of these warnings was their relationship to place. The stories were not universalized. They did not say this happens everywhere. They said this happened here. They tied danger to specific landscapes, specific coastlines, specific behaviors. This localization made the knowledge actionable. It told people where to be cautious and where to go when conditions changed. It did not require global understanding. It required familiarity with one's surroundings. When this place-based knowledge was ignored or overridden, vulnerability increased. The irony is that modern science eventually arrived at similar conclusions using entirely different methods. Geological evidence confirmed sudden subsidence. Tsunami modeling confirmed inland flooding. Hazard maps began to identify the same low-lying areas as high risk. Evacuation routes echoed ancient paths to higher ground. The difference was not in the content of the warning, but in who was considered credible. This realization forces an uncomfortable reckoning. The knowledge that could have informed safer development and earlier preparedness existed long before it was recognized by formal institutions. It was dismissed not because it was wrong, but because it did not fit dominant frameworks of validation. That dismissal had lasting effects. When the scientific case for the 1700 earthquake finally became undeniable, it did more than rewrite geological understanding. It cast earlier warnings in a new light. Stories once treated as symbolic were recognized as historical accounts. Instructions once dismissed as superstition were understood as survival strategies. But by then, much had changed. Cities had grown, infrastructure had hardened, populations had increased dramatically. The cost of ignoring those warnings had multiplied. This does not mean that earlier acceptance would have prevented all risk. Earthquakes cannot be stopped. Tsunamis cannot be negotiated with. But response can be shaped. Exposure can be reduced. Loss can be mitigated. The surviving cultures understood this. They did not frame the catastrophe as something to be conquered or mastered. They framed it as something to be respected. The land was not seen as inert. It was active, capable of sudden change, demanding attention. That worldview stands in contrast to modern approaches that often prioritize control and optimization. We build barriers. We reinforce structures. We engineer solutions that assume stability as a default. Those solutions have value, but they are incomplete without respect for long-term patterns. The warnings embedded in surviving cultures also carried an emotional dimension that scientific models often lack. They conveyed fear, loss, and humility. They acknowledged that survival sometimes depends on abandoning what is familiar, that resilience may require movement rather than resistance. These are difficult lessons. They challenge the idea that permanence is always desirable. They suggest that some places are not meant to hold fixed structures indefinitely. They emphasize flexibility over fortification. When modern societies encounter these ideas, there is often resistance. Relocation is expensive. Abandonment feels like failure. Admitting vulnerability can feel like weakness. But the cultures that survived the 1700 catastrophe did not have the luxury of denial. Their warnings emerged from necessity. It is also important to recognize that these warnings were not static. They evolved. As landscapes changed and new generations were born, the stories adapted to remain relevant. They incorporated new details. They emphasized different aspects depending on context. This adaptability is another strength often overlooked. Oral traditions are sometimes criticized for changing over time, as if change implies corruption. In reality, change can reflect refinement. It allows knowledge to stay aligned with current conditions while preserving core truths. The core truths, in this case, were remarkably stable. The ground can move violently without warning. The ocean can arrive suddenly and far inland. Survival depends on immediate action. Certain places carry greater risk. Memory matters. These truths remained intact, even as languages shifted and societies transformed. When modern researchers finally began to engage seriously with these cultural accounts, the response was not one of surprise so much as recognition. The warnings matched the evidence. They filled gaps. They explained why certain settlement patterns existed long before modern hazard analysis. This recognition did not diminish scientific authority. It enriched it. It demonstrated that understanding the Earth's behavior benefits from multiple ways of knowing. That data and memory can complement each other. That dismissing one because it does not resemble the other impoverishes both. The tragedy is not that the warnings were imperfect. It is that they were so often unheard. Even now, there is a risk of repeating that mistake. As scientific understanding advances, there is a temptation to treat older knowledge as obsolete rather than foundational, to assume that technology replaces experience rather than builds upon it. The story of the 1700 catastrophe suggests a different approach. It suggests that surviving cultures were not simply witnesses to disaster. They were analysts. They observed patterns. They tested responses. They refined guidance across generations. They tried to warn us, not with predictions, but with instructions. Listening to those warnings today does not require abandoning modern science. It requires expanding the definition of evidence. It requires humility. It requires acknowledging that some knowledge persists, not because it is written, but because it works. As attention moves forward, the challenge becomes integration. How to combine scientific models with cultural memory. How to design systems that respect both physical data and historical experience. How to plan not just for probability, but for consequence. The warnings from surviving cultures are not relics of the past. They're ongoing conversations offering perspective that remains relevant precisely because the forces they describe have not disappeared. The land beneath the coast is still accumulating stress. The ocean still stands ready to respond. The difference now is that more people are listening. Whether that listening translates into action remains an open question. It is possible to live above something for an entire lifetime and never feel it move. That is what makes this particular boundary so easy to ignore. It does not announce itself with frequent tremors. It does not tear the surface open or leave obvious scars running across the landscape. It stays hidden, locked far below the ocean, doing its work slowly enough that human senses cannot register it. And yet, it is there stretching for hundreds of miles, separating massive pieces of the planet that are constantly in motion. Every day, millions of people go about their routines above this boundary. They wake up, commute, build, plan, invest, and sleep, all on ground that feels solid and dependable. Roads stay where they were yesterday. Buildings do not lean. The coastline appears stable. This apparent calm feeds a quiet assumption that nothing fundamental is happening beneath the surface. That assumption is comfortable. It is also incorrect. The boundary offshore is not dormant. It is not relaxed. It is not finished. It is locked. Two tectonic plates meet there, one sliding beneath the other, but friction prevents smooth movement. The deeper plate keeps pushing. The upper plate resists. The result is not motion, but tension. Over time, that tension bends the land above it. Not enough to notice from one year to the next, but enough to matter over centuries. The land is not still. It is deforming. Modern instruments can measure this deformation with astonishing precision. GPS stations anchored to bedrock reveal that parts of the coast are slowly being dragged inland and upward. The movement is subtle, measured in millimeters per year. It does not crack pavement or tilt houses. It simply accumulates. This accumulation is easy to dismiss because it lacks drama. It does not interrupt daily life. It does not demand immediate response. It operates on a time scale that feels abstract compared to election cycles, construction timelines, or personal plans. So we pretend it is not there. This pretense is not usually conscious. It emerges from habit, from repetition, from the simple fact that most people judge risk based on recent experience. If the ground has not moved violently in living memory, it feels safe. If no one they know has experienced a major earthquake locally, the threat feels theoretical. The problem is that this boundary doesn't operate on the scale of memory. It operates on the scale of accumulation and release. The last time it released its stored energy was in 1700. Since then, it has been loading again. The same process is underway now as it was then. The physics have not changed, only the surface has. Above this boundary, cities have grown. Ports have expanded along coastlines that were reshaped by the last rupture. Bridges span waterways that deepened after subsidence. Power lines, pipelines, highways, and data cables cross ground that is quietly bending. Entire economies depend on infrastructure built under the assumption that the land beneath it will remain stable. This dependence creates a psychological incentive to minimize the boundary's significance. Acknowledging it fully would complicate planning. It would force uncomfortable questions about building locations, emergency preparedness, and long-term viability. It would challenge the idea that growth can proceed indefinitely without regard to geological context. So instead, the boundary is treated as background noise. It appears in technical reports. It is referenced in hazard maps. It is discussed in academic settings. But in everyday life, it fades into abstraction. Something scientists worry about. Something that might matter someday, but not today. This disconnect between knowledge and lived reality is not unique to this region. It appears wherever slow-moving risks intersect with fast-moving societies, climate change, sea level rise, resource depletion. In each case, the processes are real, measurable, and ongoing. And in each case, the absence of immediate catastrophe allows denial to coexist with data. The boundary offshore is a particularly stark example because its consequences are sudden rather than gradual. Unlike rising temperatures or creeping coastlines, it does not announce itself incrementally when it releases. It does so all at once. The pretense of absence becomes dangerous precisely because the boundary is quiet. There is also a cultural component to this pretense. Modern societies tend to value control. We engineer solutions. We reinforce structures. We believe that with enough planning, most problems can be managed. This mindset works well for many challenges. It falters when faced with forces that exceed design parameters. Earthquakes of the scale produced by locked subduction zones do not negotiate with infrastructure. They overwhelm it. This is not an argument for fatalism. It is an argument for realism. Living above. This boundary does not mean disaster is inevitable tomorrow. It means that the ground beneath daily life is part of a system with known behavior. That behavior includes long periods of calm, followed by rare but extreme events. Pretending the boundary is not there does not change that behavior. It only changes preparedness. The pretense also affects how history is interpreted. Because the last rupture occurred centuries ago, it feels distant. It is easy to relegate it to the category of ancient events disconnected from the present. But, in geological terms, 1700 was recent. The boundary has had very little time to relax since then. In many other subduction zones, similar intervals between large earthquakes are well documented. The pattern is not speculative. It is observed repeatedly across the planet. What makes this boundary unusual is not its behavior, but our relationship to it. We have inherited a landscape already altered by its last movement, but without the cultural memory of that movement embedded in mainstream narratives. We live on the aftermath while treating it as a starting point. This creates a subtle distortion. When planners assess risk, they often use recent history as a baseline. When recent history lacks major earthquakes, risk appears low. This approach works poorly for systems with long recurrence intervals. The boundary exploits this blind spot. It does not move often enough to stay present in memory. It moves rarely enough that each generation assumes the calm will continue. This assumption resets with each passing decade, reinforcing itself through experience until it breaks. At that moment, the pretense collapses instantly. The challenge is that by the time the boundary announces itself, it is too late to retrofit understanding into action. The time for preparation is always before the release, not after. This is why the story of the 1700 catastrophe matters beyond historical curiosity. It provides context that living memory lacks. It extends the timeline beyond experience. It reveals that the current calm is not the norm, but the pause. Living above this boundary also shapes how people relate to the land emotionally. There is a deep attachment to place. Coastlines are not just economic assets. They are homes, identities, and sources of meaning. Acknowledging the boundary's power can feel like questioning the permanence of those attachments. This discomfort can manifest as resistance to discussion, minimization of risk, or dismissal of worst-case scenarios as alarmist. These reactions are human. They're also predictable. The Earth does not respond to them. The boundary continues to accumulate stress regardless of how it is discussed or ignored. It does not speed up or slow down based on confidence or skepticism. It responds only to physics. One of the more subtle consequences of pretending the boundary is not there is how it shapes development priorities. When risk is abstract, cost-benefit analyses favor short-term gains. Building in low-lying areas seems reasonable. Concentrating infrastructure near the coast seems efficient. Redundancy feels unnecessary. When risk is acknowledged, those same decisions look different. The tension between these perspectives plays out quietly, often in technical committees rather than public forums. Codes are revised incrementally. Studies are commissioned. Language is softened to avoid panic. The boundary remains politely out of sight. This politeness is another form of pretense. It is not that people do not know. It is that knowing does not always translate into acting as if the knowledge matters. The cultures that survived the 1700 catastrophe acted differently. They did not pretend the boundary was absent. They integrated its existence into daily decision-making. Settlement patterns reflected caution. Stories reinforced awareness. The boundary was part of the lived environment, not an abstract concept. That integration did not eliminate risk, but it acknowledged it. Modern societies struggle with this kind of integration because our systems are complex and interdependent. Changing how we live above the boundary affects transportation, housing, commerce, and governance. The scale of adjustment feels overwhelming. So the easier path is to continue as if the boundary is irrelevant. The irony is that this path depends on the very calm that the boundary is slowly eroding. Every year of quiet reinforces confidence. Every uneventful decade strengthens the illusion of safety. The longer the pause lasts, the harder it becomes to imagine its end. This is the psychological trap of rare events. They feel impossible until they happen. Then they feel inevitable in hindsight. Living above this boundary means living with that tension, whether acknowledged or not. The question is not whether the boundary exists, but whether its existence is incorporated into how people think, plan, and prepare. Pretending it is not there does not make life more stable. It makes it more fragile. The land beneath cities and coastlines is not static. It is part of a dynamic system that has already demonstrated its capacity for sudden change. The absence of recent upheaval does not erase that demonstration. It merely places it outside everyday awareness. Silence has a way of being misunderstood. We often interpret it as absence, as inactivity, as reassurance. When nothing happens for a long time, we begin to assume that nothing is happening at all. The longer the quiet lasts, the more convincing it becomes. This is especially true when the silence surrounds something we would rather not think about. The ground is not shaking. The ocean is behaving. Life continues, and so the silence feels earned, even deserved. But the silence that follows a great release of energy is not emptiness. It is accumulation. The last great rupture reset the physical system. Stress that had built for centuries was discharged in minutes. The boundary slipped. The land dropped. The ocean moved. Then the system began again, slowly, predictably, and invisibly. The silence that followed was not a conclusion. It was an interval. That interval has now lasted more than 3 centuries. From a human perspective, 3 centuries feels immense. It spans generations beyond easy counting. It exceeds the lifespan of institutions, cities, even nations. When we say that nothing like the 1700 catastrophe has happened since, what we really mean is that nothing like it has happened within the limits of our inherited memory. That distinction matters. From the perspective of the boundary, 3 centuries is not long at all. The same forces that drove the plates together before 1700 have continued uninterrupted. The deeper plate keeps pushing. The upper plate keeps resisting. The friction that locked them before has not vanished. It has simply resumed its work. Millimeter by millimeter, the system reloads. The silence we are living in now is not passive. It is active, even if it feels calm. What the next great silence could bring depends not on whether the boundary will break again, but on when and on how prepared the world above it will be when it does. That preparation is shaped in part by how the silence is interpreted. If silence is treated as safety, vulnerability grows. If silence is treated as opportunity, resilience becomes possible. The difficulty is that silence rarely feels urgent. It does not demand action. It does not interrupt routines. It allows delay to masquerade as prudence. Plans can always be revisited later. Budgets can be allocated elsewhere. Warnings can be acknowledged without being acted upon. The next great silence is already doing its work in this way. Cities continue to densify along coastlines. Critical infrastructure clusters near ports and waterways. Housing expands into low-lying areas shaped by past subsidence. Each of these decisions is reasonable when evaluated in isolation. Together, they form a pattern of exposure. Exposure does not cause disasters. It amplifies them. The next rupture, when it comes, will not create new coastlines from scratch. It will act on what already exists. It will shake what has been built. It will flood what lies within reach. It will stress systems that have grown accustomed to stability. The silence between now and then is the only time when those systems can be adjusted deliberately rather than reactively. What makes this silence particularly challenging is that it coexists with knowledge. This is not a case of ignorance. The science is clear. The models exist. The evidence is robust. The question is not whether the event is possible. It is whether its possibility is allowed to influence present-day choices. That influence is uneven. Some preparations are visible. Building codes have been updated in many places. Early warning systems are being developed and tested. Evacuation routes are mapped and marked. Public education efforts exist, though they vary in reach and depth. Other preparations are less visible and more difficult. They involve questioning where development occurs in the first place. They involve long-term land use planning that prioritizes safety over convenience. They involve acknowledging that some areas may not be suitable for permanent infrastructure, regardless of economic appeal. These are uncomfortable conversations. They challenge deeply held assumptions about growth, ownership, and progress. The silence allows those conversations to be postponed. Another dimension of the silence is psychological. Humans are adept at normalizing risk when it does not manifest. Each quiet year reinforces the belief that the next year will be quiet as well. This belief is not usually articulated. It simply settles in. This settling creates a feedback loop. The longer nothing happens, the less likely people are to expect something to happen. The less they expect it, the less they prepare. The less they prepare, the more severe the consequences when the silence ends. This is not a moral failing. It is a cognitive pattern. Rare events are difficult to hold in mind without constant reminders. They compete poorly with immediate concerns. Jobs, families, finances, and daily challenges demand attention. A hypothetical future catastrophe struggles to justify space in that crowded landscape. The next great silence thrives in this competition. It allows risk to remain abstract. It allows preparedness to be framed as optional rather than essential. It allows the boundary beneath the ocean to remain a concept rather than a presence. And yet the silence is not empty. The land continues to bend. GPS stations record slow motion that never stops. Strain accumulates quietly, imperceptibly. Each year of silence is not a year of rest, but a year of loading. This loading does not accelerate or decelerate based on awareness. It follows the physics of plate motion. The only variable is the length of time before release. When release occurs, the silence ends abruptly. The next great silence could bring a rupture that lasts minutes, but alters decades. It could bring shaking strong enough to overwhelm structures designed only for moderate motion. It could bring tsunamis that arrive faster than evacuation plans assume. It could bring cascading failures across systems that depend on electricity, communication, and transportation. These possibilities are not speculative fantasies. They are extrapolations, grounded in what already happened, adjusted for what now exists. The 1700 catastrophe occurred in a world with far fewer people and far less infrastructure. Its impact was profound, but localized. A similar event today would unfold differently, not because the Earth would behave differently, but because the surface has changed. The silence between then and now has allowed complexity to accumulate above the boundary. Complexity increases efficiency. It also increases fragility. Interdependent systems can fail in chains. Power outages affect water supply. Communication failures complicate emergency response. Transportation disruptions hinder evacuation and recovery. The silence before the event does nothing to reduce these interdependencies. It allows them to grow. This is one of the paradoxes of modern preparedness. Advances that improve daily life can magnify disaster impacts if they are not designed with disruption in mind. The next great silence could bring an opportunity as well. It offers time. Time to integrate lessons from the past into present planning. Time to listen to both scientific evidence and cultural memory. Time to build redundancy, flexibility, and awareness. Time is the one resource that disappears the moment the boundary releases. Once the shaking starts, decisions are no longer deliberate. They are reactive. Once the waves are generated, response windows shrink rapidly. Once systems begin to fail, recovery becomes exponentially harder. The silence is when choices matter most. This does not mean living in constant anticipation or fear. It means treating the silence as meaningful rather than neutral. It means recognizing that quiet intervals are part of the system, not exceptions to it. The cultures that survived past catastrophes understood this intuitively. Their warnings were not about panic. They were about readiness. They did not predict dates. They emphasize responses. Modern societies often invert this emphasis. We ask when instead of how. We seek certainty where only probability exists. When certainty cannot be provided, action is deferred. The next great silence exposes the limits of that approach. No one can say exactly when the boundary will break again. But that uncertainty does not negate the certainty that it will. The difference between those two statements is often blurred in public discourse, with uncertainty about timing mistaken for uncertainty about occurrence. The silence benefits from this confusion. What it could bring, ultimately, depends on how that confusion is resolved. If uncertainty is used as a reason for inaction, the silence will end with surprise. If uncertainty is accepted as a reason for preparation, the silence can be used productively. This distinction shapes outcomes more than magnitude ever will. A well-prepared society can endure severe shaking with fewer losses. A poorly prepared one can suffer catastrophic consequences from the same event. The Earth does not choose outcomes. It sets conditions. Human choices determine vulnerability. The next great silence is shaping those choices right now quietly without comment. It is also shaping narratives. As time passes, the 1700 event recedes further into the past. It risks becoming an academic case study rather than a living context. Maintaining its relevance requires intentional effort, education, storytelling, integration into planning. Silence erodes relevance unless countered. This erosion is subtle. It happens through omission rather than denial, through prioritization rather than dismissal. Other issues take precedence. Attention shifts. Memory fades. The land does not participate in this fading. It continues to accumulate stress with perfect recall. The silence could bring complacency. It could bring delay. It could bring an even greater disconnect between knowledge and action. Or it could bring resolve. It could bring an understanding that calm is not the same as safety, that stability is not permanence, that the absence of recent disaster is not proof of future security. These understandings are not dramatic. They do not demand immediate upheaval. They invite steady, thoughtful adjustment. The next great silence is not waiting to ambush the unprepared. It is offering time to those willing to use it. What it brings will depend on whether that offer is recognized. After spending so much time moving through layers of past events, buried evidence, and long stretches of silence, it becomes important to return gently to where things actually are. Not to dismiss what came before, and not to rush toward what might come next, but to arrive back in the present with a clearer sense of context. The present moment is where all of this ultimately matters, not as a source of fear, but as a place of awareness. Right now, the ground beneath you is still. That simple statement carries more weight than it seems. Stillness in this context is not emptiness. It is a condition, a temporary state within a system that has demonstrated its ability to change suddenly. Understanding that does not require constant vigilance or anxiety. It simply invites a different quality of attention, one that is calm, grounded, and realistic. The story of the 1700 catastrophe and everything uncovered since is not meant to pull the mind endlessly backward or push it anxiously forward. It exists to deepen how the present is understood, to replace the illusion of permanence with a more accurate sense of continuity and change. Continuity is what allows daily life to function. You expect the floor to support you. You expect the walls to remain upright. You expect tomorrow to resemble today, closely enough that plans make sense. These expectations are not foolish. They are necessary. Without them, society would grind to a halt. At the same time, continuity does not mean stasis. The land has shown more than once that it can reorganize itself without consulting human schedules. That reality does not invalidate, everyday expectations. It simply places them within a broader frame. Settling back into the present moment means holding both truths at once. It means recognizing that while the earth beneath the coast is part of a dynamic system, it is also currently quiet enough to support ordinary life. That quiet is not something to be feared or rushed through. It is something to inhabit thoughtfully. Awareness does not require constant anticipation of disaster. In fact, that kind of anticipation often leads to paralysis rather than preparedness. What awareness offers instead is proportion, a sense of scale, an understanding that the present moment is one point along a long arc, not a fragile anomaly. From this perspective, the silence becomes less ominous and more informative. It tells you that the system is in its loading phase, that energy is accumulating slowly, that nothing needs to happen right now. For that to be true, it allows room for measured response rather than reflexive reaction. This is where many discussions of risk falter. They treat awareness as synonymous with alarm. They assume that acknowledging danger must disrupt peace. The story you've just followed suggests otherwise. The cultures that lived with this boundary for generations did not exist in a constant state of fear. They integrated knowledge of risk into daily life without letting it dominate. Stories were told, practices were adjusted, attention was maintained, life went on. That balance is possible. In the modern world, balance often looks different. It takes the form of planning rather than storytelling, of design rather than ritual, of education rather than oral repetition. These are not lesser forms. They are simply different tools. Settling back into the present moment involves recognizing which tools are appropriate. Now, for most people, that does not mean changing where they live or how they sleep tonight. It does not mean abandoning coastlines or living in constant readiness. It means understanding that preparedness is a background condition, not a foreground obsession. It also means accepting that not everything needs to be resolved immediately. One of the reasons the story of the 1700 catastrophe can feel heavy is that it deals with forces that operate beyond human control. Earthquakes cannot be negotiated with. Tectonic plates do not respond to intention. For minds accustomed to agency and influence, this can feel unsettling. Returning to the present helps reframe that discomfort. The present moment is not about controlling the earth. It is about responding appropriately to what is known. Control is not required for preparedness. Understanding allows choices to be made calmly, rather than reactively. It allows risk to be acknowledged without being dramatized. It allows long-term planning to coexist with short-term stability. The ground being still right now is not a promise. It is a condition, one that can be appreciated without being romanticized. There is also something grounding in recognizing how much time exists between catastrophic events. The intervals are long. They span centuries. That matters. It means that while the risk is real, it is not imminent in the way daily threats are. The human nervous system is not designed to stay activated over such time scales, and it should not be asked to. Settling into the present means letting go of the need to constantly monitor the boundary in the mind. The work of preparedness happens collectively through systems, planning, and shared knowledge. It does not need to occupy every individual moment. This distinction often gets lost in discussions of geological risk. People hear about massive earthquakes and feel personally responsible for anticipating them. That burden is unnecessary and counterproductive. The present moment is allowed to be ordinary. It is allowed to include rest, routine, and calm. In fact, those things are part of resilience. A society that cannot rest cannot respond well when disruption occurs. The long silence before the next rupture is not meant to be filled with anxiety. It is meant to be used to build structures that bend rather than break, used to design systems with redundancy rather than fragility, used to share information in ways that are accessible rather than alarming. Most of that work happens quietly, far from daily awareness. That is as it should be. The story you have followed does not ask you to live differently tomorrow morning. It asks you to see the present moment differently. To recognize that the apparent stability of the land is part of a cycle, not a contradiction of it. To understand that memory and evidence can coexist even when they are stored in different forms. To accept that silence is not emptiness, but a phase. There is also something comforting in realizing that the Earth's processes are consistent. They may be powerful, but they are not capricious. They follow rules. They repeat patterns. They do not single out moments for punishment or